Hello friends! I hope you're doing well. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Makara, and I'm going to introduce what we might consider the mission or the victory condition of each of the signs of the Zodiac. This is going to be the first full series with a video for each, and there will also be a supercut available with timestamps so you can view the whole thing through. These are based on dividing the needs of humanity into 12 parts, so that if we achieve a state of stability in each area, every single person on the planet should theoretically get their needs met. Because of climate change and degradation of the environment, restoration efforts are automatically a part of each of these and integral to them, but some signs in particular have even more focus on remediation, and we will go into detail on that. I'd like to share with you this snippet from Jared Diamond, which is his response when being asked what is the one problem in all of the world's problems that is the most important, that if we were to solve this one thing, it would have the most impact.
People often ask me, Jared, what's the most important thing that we need to do about the world's environmental problems? And my answer is the most important thing we need to do is to forget about there being any single thing that is the most important thing we need to do. Instead, there are a dozen things, any one of which could do us in, and we've got to get them all right. Because if we solve 11 and we fail to solve the 12th, we're in trouble. For example, if we solve our problems of water and soil and population, but don't solve our problems of toxics, then we are in trouble.
I love that. There's about a dozen things, There's a dozen problems, and we have to get all of them right. That's exactly it. If we were to split up the 12 main needs of humanity into these 12 pieces, this is what they would start to shape up like. And in order to tackle a really big problem, it's important to break it down into manageable pieces and get the best possible people to work on that job in a committee, and then step back and give them the space that they need to apply creative thinking to those problems. And I believe that factions and the committees within them are ultimately going to be how we break down and actually tackle these problems that a lot of people are just throwing up their hands in the air and saying it's too big, there's nothing we can do about it, and essentially resigning themselves to what? Destruction of the planet, to the end of the human race. I don't really see defeat as an option. So I think if we try to fight back with everything that we've got, and we work hard and smart, all of these things are not only doable, but instead of being this horrible, unfair challenge that was imposed upon us, by some horrible decisions on the part of previous generations, and woe is us, I prefer to view it as the missions by which we define ourselves, and our showing here speaks to something far more greater, to the quality of our spirits and to the resilience of our souls. Every single generation faces incredible challenges. For us, climate change is staring us in the face as the dragon itself, and are we going to face it? Are we going to work together and find a way, or be devoured? But in a very general sense, what we are talking about here is forming committees to manage things like utilities, healthcare, civil engineering, and so forth, things that are generally entrusted to a government to oversee. Because of corruption, mismanagement of resources, failure to address the complexity of human need, and wasteful spending, of course, there are entire categories that have been altogether overlooked, and depending on where you are in the world, one of these may be receiving the lion's share of the funding at the detriment of the others. It is not feasible to expect a government to be able to do this. In reality, they never have. Even the best of systems, it still needs to be informed by scientific and professional organizations. That's not to say we should overthrow the government and promote anarchy, not at all. But I think it will become naturally evident that since we made up these institutions completely out of our imaginations, it will be just as possible to imagine them differently. Less resources will be wasted on the administrative procedures themselves, and instead they will be better utilized on the work itself that needs to be done. A great example of how this works is in something like a nonprofit. There are regulations about transparency and disclosing how much of the donations go towards the thing that they are actually supposed to be doing, be it saving animals or funding research. And if you actually go and look into these, you might be a little bit shocked how much of the funding that they raise is then spent on marketing and trying to get more donations. But because they hold the title of nonprofit, right, which somehow that term has become synonymous with good cause, to such a degree that just in my country, the United States, over $1 billion are donated to a charity every single day. Now, personally, I don't see $1 billion of improved quality of living in my country or community. That seems like a pretty astronomical number to be spent on programs which are, for the most part, just picking up the slack where our government is failing to address our needs. In fact, the government often specifically uses the existence of these organizations as grounds to defend their inaction. These people don't need food stamps. They can just go down to the church and get into the food pantry. My favorite JFK quote is, "A rising tide lifts all ships." I love that. There should be no need for a violent interruption, and the best designs are ones that peacefully replace outdated ones by virtue of their inherent usefulness and the value which they provide. So with that in mind, let's examine today the way in which the conflict system provides the greatest possible value to all of humanity. I will introduce the zodiac signs in terms of their mission. I've touched a little bit on how this benefits the individual by alleviating their decision fatigue. The biggest criticism that I've heard about my work to anyone that I've spoken to about it is that having something predetermined for you at birth somehow infringes upon you and your personal freedom. I think that might be artificially exacerbated by American brainwashing, this need to be independent, unique, self-deterministic, etc. So that's something that we are going to have to pick apart with great care in the future. But the reality is that there are many factors completely outside of our control that limit our options already, be it race, nationality, gender, family structure, economy, ad nauseum. The question is, if it were possible to trade all of those things, those arbitrary things that are thrust upon us at birth, if we were to be able to trade them for something like this, which is actually equitable, would we do it? Could we end racism forever by instead formulating our factionality based on the zodiac signs? Psychologically, from all of my studies, it isn't possible for humans not to discriminate at all, and in fact, it wouldn't be desirable to do so. The ability to draw conclusions quickly from our circumstances and react is a part of what keeps us alive. We just need to train that into discernment rather than impulse via wisdom. But there are many benefits to being part of a team or a tribe, and we need to figure out how to do that in a way that doesn't actually put anyone above one another. And it is my heartfelt belief that this is how we do that. If the distribution is fairly even, out of 7.5 billion people on Earth right now, a little over 500 million are the ones on your team. That means that out of the global 6 degrees of separation we have to every other person on Earth, the factional degrees are actually closer to the speculated genetic ones, which are estimated at 3. You are between 3 and 4 handshakes away from every other member of your zodiacal faction, tops, with cusps making up theoretically up to 10% of the population, it's even less. This metaphor of handshakes is frequently used to demonstrate the interconnectedness of everyone on the planet. I prefer the one used by Alan Watts, which is the concept of Gigi Muge. Everything is connected in this sort of galactic spider web where there's this matrix of threads forming the underpinning and infinite number of tiny little water droplets hang on the thread, and each water droplet is reflecting back all of the others. In my mind, it's not just a spider web, but it's actually a mandala in which all of the petals are joined in the center. And in the center, Om Mani Padme Hum, there's the crystal. And to me, we're not just drops of water, but we're all crystal grains of sand, which are shimmering the whole of the universe back at one another. But by all means, meditate with whatever visual resonates with you. The point is that you don't need necessarily to get to some sort of yogi state of interconnected oneness with the whole of the world. That's a big leap for every single individual, and it's hard for the physical body to maintain the full spectrum of flow all the time and be completely tuned in. That's not necessarily the goal. What we want is to reach a state of personal vibration which is high and fulfilling and productive, and tracks and resonates with those 3 degrees. That makes up one tier of the mandala, right? And then each subsequent tier can interweave with those. And if the foundation is strong there, there's no limit to what we can build upon out beyond that. Just like the pyramidal hierarchy of needs, right? With a strong base of physical security, we can ascend higher in the more complex fulfillment of abstract needs, like personal meaning. For each sign, to help illustrate how one might go about contributing to these victory conditions, I will introduce a contemporary person who is influential in these missions, as an example. As a little word of warning, you do have to be kind of careful about the kind of goals that you're setting, because the thing that you're shooting for, while it is really important to go ahead and put in the work and strive and get it, you have to be kind of aware that it might not be the real end goal. And there's this kind of paradox that occurs when you're really successful. Even when you get to the top of whatever hierarchy you're competing in, when you turn around and look back at your progress, it might not really be what you thought. These are just examples. It's not meant to be taken literally as you should go do exactly this, but it's to give you something to look up to, because the people that we're encouraged to view as heroes or successful, basically they're not necessarily who we should be looking up to, because a lot of them get to that place of success and then they just take the money and run, or they self-destruct, and we're not idolizing the real brave people, the real trailblazers, the way that we should. A lot of times we are encouraged to idolize the people who have achieved a lot of fame or have a lot of money, and it's not good for us, it's not good for them, and we know a lot about people in especially sports and music who turn out to be very deeply unhappy and are very unfulfilled personally. So even though they got the fame that supposedly everybody wants, at the end of that road, when you turn around and look back on your life, if you haven't forged your own meaning along the way, you end up feeling empty. So that kind of happens regardless of the path that you're on. That's a pretty universal nature of achievement. Kind of something that everybody is going to go through if they strive for greatness and try to find the best possible version of themselves. So we're going to go over some examples of that, which I think are particularly poignant in this current time, and talk about the work that they're doing So if that is your sign and you recognize this person, you can have different examples of what success means and what self-determination is. The focus overall, I do want to keep on this umbrella idea of what a victory condition is, what each faction's purpose is, and talk in a more broad way about all of the ways that you might contribute to and be sharing in the benefit of that collective goal. Through factions, we get the guidance in the structure and all of the benefits that you get from working together as a team, while also having an individual benefit of taking some of the decision fatigue away and being sort of automatically validated in your personal choices because you're able to be more decisive and you can be much more confident in your plan. So the mission of Aries. Aries is a rough one because any way I slice this, it's going to sound bad. But in a very primeval way, the purpose of Aries is war. And for most of human history, what that has meant is aggression, the actual act of war, invasion, and everything that comes with that. From my perspective, as an American, our spending is absolutely astronomical. And if we were to pick even just one issue to fix, I feel like this one is really going to cascade down to all the others in the most impactful possible way. But improving all of those 12 areas must be done so in a balanced and synergistic way to maximize the positive impact within our lifetimes. It's not enough to be like, oh, we're going to fix it so our kids can enjoy the benefits of it. No, that kind of procrastination is what got us into such hot water in the first place. It is a sad attempt to play the martyr and offset the responsibility ultimately onto them, while deluding ourselves with virtue signaling. If you do your best here and now for your own benefit, and with the understanding that you may also come back to this place in a future life, then only good results can follow. What we need is to be incrementally increasing everything in this balanced way. Else we just become lopsided with these great gains in one area to the detriment of another. For example, our advances in technology, while neglecting our social evolution, is why we see the disconnect, the cognitive dissonance, when it comes to the impact the internet has had on humans. And now we have to play catch-up and try to understand its side effects. When I say Aries has a core victory condition of war, what I mean by that is, of course, absolutely the opposite. And they are in charge of disarming and figuring out the correct way to divert that need for policing. It's about how do we reclaim the weapons and disarm on a very physical level, right? How do we sniff out landmines? How do we ethically round up guns and get them out of the hands of children? How do we pacify, but still remain dangerous personally? The classical text on that is, of course, The Art of War, which talks about the mental discipline of knowing the self, knowing the enemy, in that sort of strategic chessboard type of way, and how we can avoid conflict altogether, or at least minimize the casualties. The warrior's path has to do with aggression being the very last resort, and trying all of these other methods for resolution. And the classic way of manifesting and dealing with that is, of course, to be a soldier, get involved in a very literally militaristic way, or martial arts. Climb the ranks, become a commanding officer, general, or what have you, and then be in charge of people and try to apply that wisdom. Unfortunately, the chain of command is so broken in this country that the wisdom of the people who have actually seen war and served is completely disregarded in a way that I find very personally offensive. Maybe you do as well. So one issue that it would be good, I think, of Aries to look at is how to give those people a voice and respect the sacrifices that they have made and the experience that they have gained. It's a touchy subject, but to make the world a better place, we need to really address that issue. I think that the trend has been to deal with this in an exclusively political way, but it really excludes the individual and has polarized the opinions about it. And I just don't think that's all there is to it. Of course, the discussion always gets into weird, dangerous territory of militias and stuff. That's not what we're talking about. That's not what I'm calling for at all. But I would like Aries as a serious, organized group having very intense, intelligent conversations about how we actually disarm. Our answer in America is kind of just to weaponize everyone. Maybe I'm the unpopular opinion here, but I don't think guns are really the optimal way to go about that. There's just too many issues that come with regulating them, and you can't shoot a hurricane. Those are occurring more and more frequently. For me, the very best thing to do, because the gun is only going to be a solution in a very narrow parameter of circumstances, is that everybody needs to be more physically capable as an individual. They need to be trained to handle physically demanding situations and be ready. So Aries really has to be with readiness and preparations physically. Fitness is at the top of the ways to be involved, because we kind of paradoxically have this obsession, and we're pouring tons and tons and tons of money into the fitness industry, evidently. $27.8 billion in the US. Nice. I really hate going to the gym myself, so my opinion here is completely invalid, but from what I can see, it's a little bit more towards the vain side of things, and maybe not so much for fitness for wellness' sake. And there does seem to be kind of a weird psychological predatory business model surrounding getting people to want to go to the gym to take their money in membership fees. It wouldn't be a business if it wasn't profitable, and the fact that there are so many gyms and they're taking up a lot of real estate, for what? Why are there different levels of it, or why do there have to be these restrictions to access? We need to remove barriers for entry, just for general disease prevention and physical therapy and recovery. To start looking at the needs of elderly people and people really needing physical therapy. We need to take a careful look at the mentality that it's creating and the kind of toxic body image that it's perpetuating. Our current social paradigm is further isolating and distancing people who would probably benefit greatly and like to participate. It seems unavailable to them, and they feel like you have to look a certain way or be performing at a certain level to go to these places. And so by removing these barriers to entry, I think that is the charge of an Aries, in part. I think it's important to interject that there is something of a difference. There's going to be a little bit of overlap between policing as a social issue and incarceration as a social issue. And my understanding is that Aries is more in control of the policing, but Sagittarius has to do more with incarceration. More about, that in detail, what that really means under Sagittarius, which would be the lack thereof, and actually using techniques to rehabilitate rather than just incarcerate on this mass scale that we are currently doing later on in the Sagittarius section. But be aware that in all of these subjects there will be overlap and interlace, especially when elements or motivations are held in common by those two signs. And Aries would not necessarily be acting against the interest of their own mission if they work on something more to do with the latter topic of incarceration. Please, please, please keep in mind through all of this that the victory condition is meant to act as a guideline, not a set direct, this is the only way, this is what you have to do. It's meant to be a structure. It is a scaffolding to hang ideas upon, not to be a narrow road that everybody is driven down by force. Okay? It is meant to act as a guideline, which holds the highest concentration on what might be thought of as a spectrum of concentrations. Where the color blends on the edges with the neighboring factions is a perfectly legitimate position to hold in your mission in life. And if you are fulfilled and comfortable there, then that is exactly where you belong. So I will touch back into the individual's relationship to their vocation and faction at a later point in greater detail, but basically the only things that wouldn't be allowed for any member of any faction are jobs which are predatory, wasteful, soul-sucking, opportunistic on the misfortune of others, holding another person in your debt, or any type of coercion or duress. Those are completely impermissible for anyone of the conflux to do. So there are actually a lot of things which are perfectly legal and acceptable now that will not be, to put it plainly. And, you know, I find that sentiment really comforting myself. So with those things in mind, war, fitness, policing, let's take a look at our general example, my nominee for a representative of the Aries mission. As I said, this is not someone who has signed on for this per se, but they are operating at a high level in the interest of this faction, so I nominate them as such. As the word implies, general is the term for any Pareto operating individuals within the conflux, but each faction, including the cusps, has its own title, so that when they are introduced, you already know which team they belong to. These may change with time. If the factions just reject my suggestions, that's totally within their right to do. These are just my suggestions, but I like them. I thought an awful lot about them. I've spent a lot of time on this. And they add a little something, you know. I like to be extra, as you might have noticed. So it should come as no shock whatsoever that all of these over-the-top levels of detail continue to be revealed. So for Aries, it is Marshal, or War Marshal. Yeah, I have not introduced any of this yet, so I'll do a video about that soon, at some point. Not gonna lie, I was a little disappointed to discover that it wasn't Jocko Willink, because he has been so inspirational on these topics for me right now. But part of the fun of this type of research is reconnecting with people who have been inspirational at other stages of my life. And when I started racking my brain about this one, Aries in particular, I finally broke down and looked it up, and the result brought a smile to my face. So it's not all bad. I was beat up a lot when I was a little kid. That might be relatable to some of you. I was extremely small and usually alone, so the natural reaction is to take up self-defense, right? That's what you do. I didn't get really into it until high school, but when I did, I was attracted to Kung Fu, and an idol that I wasn't really vocal about, but I looked up to nonetheless and followed the work of, was Jackie Chan. He is the original trailblazer in my eyes, and he really paved the way for so many other people to go forward with their careers by becoming the first international movie star and really opening minds about ethnicity in movies and what they're capable of and how to be more inclusive at a time that was, you know, pretty exclusionary and closed-minded. So beyond the excellence that he exhibits in his craft and originality, he goes really far above and beyond to encourage and include others and bridge cultural gaps. I really identified with his stubborn dedication to doing everything himself, all of his own stunts and all of that, and doing it his way. But at the same time, he is extremely humble and patient with letting others around him bloom into their own and appreciating their contributions. The best fights are ones which we avoid. It's a quote from him. He embodies the theatrical exploration of violence as art, and I believe that this is going to be a crucial discipline for Aries moving forward. The goal is not to eliminate all thrill, risk, or struggle from this life. It is impossible to do so, and we would not want to. But if we can take the danger of fatality from altercations and disband their organized and compelled forms, where the end goal is mass fatality, we can then be free to explore the art of war for the purpose of self-mastery. It's fun to note here, he is also kind of Zodiac obsessed, so that makes him a prime candidate for this position, but I want to nominate him here, not just for the things that people usually look up to him for, such as the stunt performances, but for his willingness to try new things and fail, to take risks in the face of uncertainty, and to train really hard. His philanthropic endeavors are a bit spread out, rather than taking a stand really on any one thing. He has this habit of, I do small things, I try to do good things every day. If everyone does some good, think of what good this world will be. I like that. I think it speaks to the rebellious nature of wholesomeness in this day and age, to see that something could be done and personally step up to do it, even if it seems small, because sometimes it takes only one act of kindness to change a person's life. And that's a concept that I touch on in the Starfish story, which was the aphorism which really set the tone for my formative years. You can go back and watch it if you are interested. Maybe it sounds corny, but I actually believe it. And if this man, who is certifiably one of the most badass people of all time, says things like that too, then there just might be something to it. But as soon as I had begun the research for the script of this and came to that conclusion, an interview was posted with the person that it had been my gut instinct to include. And if you get the chance, I highly recommend watching examples of any of these people actually speaking. Listen and let them represent themselves, because I let my own bias rule this one out initially. And as soon as he started speaking, I knew I had made a mistake. Robert Downey Jr. is, by virtue of his role as Iron Man, one of the most influential war critics of our modern mythos, certainly during the very turbulent times in my youth, the war in Iraq and in Afghanistan. It was very timely and stood out as maybe our generation's criticism, and at least got the discussion going. It seems to have really tapered off in recent years, but at the time, I really felt like he stood up to the challenge of that criticism, and I don't know, it did speak to me personally, but I hate superhero stuff. I hate hero stuff like that. So my own personal bias really gets in the way sometimes of my gratitude, and that's a problem and something that I'm working on, certainly. Yeah, I hate superheroes. I hate them. But obviously, economically and culturally, they are very significant, and out of all of them, that was definitely the hero that stood out because of that timeliness and what was going on. And Aries has a lot to do with timing itself, I think, too. And he spoke on that, actually, in the interview. Not needing to keep punching the gas and taking whatever you can get in life, but learning to put your gun down. That's the suchness right there, isn't it? So the purpose of bringing up any of these figures is not to provide some sort of biographical rundown, but to look at the work that they are currently doing and how that might be relevant to the faction agenda. So he has been a very vocal advocate of reform of criminal justice and of improving outcomes. Acting and role play are the same practice, and he talks about maintaining consistency in that by laying out your action and what you are supposed to be doing. Staying focused solely on that helps you to keep from wandering off track. And finding parallels in your own life and letting yourself become the character that you are portraying, staying true to the story that you need to tell, and creating something meaningful because of it. Well, that's why we are here, right? Taurus is charged with food security, agricultural systems, and nutrition. This includes things like safeguarding biodiversity, conducting research on changing soil and weather conditions, developing crops better suited to grow in those difficult conditions, using plants to stabilize and improve landscapes, retain and filter water, prevent erosion, and so on. It's a very broad subject. Anything falling under farming, landscaping, terraforming, foraging, husbanding, forestry, things of that nature. What I did there. Oh, it's bad. Oh, just accept it. I'll touch on the Virgo overlaps later. Being both earth element, there's going to be substantial overlap in these related topics. One way to think of the distinction might be that Taurus deals with the base ingredients, those that make up large quantity of the recipes, such as like the grains, rice, wheat, beans, legumes, oats, the staples of the diet, right? Whereas Virgo deals with the extracts, herbs, zests, things in small quantities that might be considered medicinal. So it's like one is the biscuit and the other is the tea. And the way in which both are grown are largely different. The crops and herds of Taurus couldn't be constrained necessarily to a greenhouse, so projects geared towards reform in this direction have to do with the responsible utilization of farmland for the most part. The first thing that we must do is dissolve the notion of unlimited growth. Soil can be very quickly destroyed and depleted with improper practices. Evidently, we are currently destroying usable soil at a rate 10 times greater than what the earth can replenish. And we are now facing a crisis with GMOs and the fertilizers and pesticides that accompany them. We are making what was once fertile land unusable by literally salting our own fields. Ironically, there may be great need in the future to engineer crops that will be more tolerant to salt in order to try to reverse what has been done and retake some of the desert that is being created when land is used up within a couple of growing cycles and then abandoned in favor of new fields made available by burning what was once habitat. Eduardo Blumwald is one such leader in botany, developing the first sodium-tolerant tomatoes. Genetic modification has become a sensational buzzword, but in truth humans have been using selective breeding techniques since the dawn of agriculture to encourage desirable traits. Geneticists must now battle the public image fiasco brought on by the demonic practices of one company in particular, in addition to being strapped for resources by lack of funding toward combating environmental degradation in general. While organic farming and eliminating the use of harmful chemicals is the top priority of the Taurus mission, ethical genetic research is closely related as well. Abundance is trust in the process, not an unrealistic expectation that everything is going to be automatically resupplying for our convenience. In order for natural processes to be perpetual, there have to be seasons or cycles which restore the conditions necessary for their fertility. for most plants and crops, we see this in the seasons of the year, and disparage the ones that are not productive or desirable to us. But it is these periods of rest which make explosive growth possible. And as omnivores, we should be able to source our dietary needs from a variety of places year-round, but instead we have opted to interrupt this by importing food from farther and farther away. This destroys the nutritional value, as transit takes a toll on the quality. Fruits must be picked before they're prime, way before they're ripe, in hopes that they are at a desirable stage by the time that they arrive at their market. And it puts undue pressure on the environments and economies of the places of their origin. We rely on preservation and processing to make things available in seasons when they shouldn't be. And simply put, it's not good for us or for the planet. Our food is making us sick with the overuse of pesticides, harmful fillers, and chemicals oriented towards quantity over quality. A lot of Virgos have come forward to argue with me that the growing of plants is their jurisdiction, but I think a primordial duty was placed on Taurus for the sourcing of food. Each iteration of the evolution of the bovine, from the auroch to the buffalo to the modern-day Guernsey cow, has played a crucial role in feeding humanity. So it is fitting that this right and responsibility now falls to the bull to redefine what that relationship will be and what will come to make up the bulk of our diet. I myself have been doing extensive research on plant-based diet principles for a thing that I'm working on, which you, the viewer, know nothing about. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And the conclusion that I have come to is that we need to get our proportions under control and dismantle the agro-industrial complex, of course. But as omnivores, and this is just my opinion personally from the research that I'm doing and what I found in life, you don't necessarily have to agree with me, but as omnivores, I think that there will always be a need for symbiotic relationships with other animals, such as the ethical farming of dairy. I think the classification of honey as non-vegan friendly is beyond absurd. In all of nature you see agreements and trades for protection and food, and the pressure is on us to be creative and use this codependence for the benefit of the animals and the environment that they live in. Bees are at the very top of this priority list for obvious reason. Making beekeeping more profitable is the single best thing that we can do in the interest of pollinating plants everywhere. During the transition, as long as things are profitable and education is made available on how to go about monetizing good things, people will be able to step up on a local level. That was the attitude that I really held when I began this over a decade ago. And I spent a lot of resources and energy on local business mentorship. I now know that it's a little bit too little too late, and that more needs to be done on a wide scale to address the severity of this problem. But without building in this local resilience, we could lose a lot more valuable people to poverty. So it's still very much worth doing, even if it doesn't seem to make a wide impact. The conclusion that I came to after visiting Germany, which is relevant here because this is the location of Taurus's resonance, of course, is that they place a high priority on not making things worse. It sounds weird to say it that way, but it's actually pretty great. They may be slow-moving on taking the kind of extreme action I deem necessary to combat climate change, but when they see something on fire, they have the good sense not to throw gas on it, which we Americans can't seem to help ourselves but do. This is an obvious illustration of why we need a 12-part approach to the complexity of this problem. And we need to do everything that we can to promote different approaches and points of view, because there is a time and a place for everything. But this notion of not making it worse, paying special attention to what is not done, and exercising restraint in intervening into natural processes is going to play a key role in reforming food production around the world. And this psychological role of food and the way that we eat, the setting, the timing, the social implications, all need special attention as well if we are going to make any headway in bridging the gap between the starving and the wasteful. To boil this down into 3 charges, we might say that Taurus has a mission of organic, sustainable agriculture, ethical animal husbandry, and restorative land usage. Food security as far as distribution does also fall here, but I suspect there will be a crossover into what would be more of Cancer's domain. Hospitality, family, gatherings are of course not exclusive to any sign, and each will have great diversity in their specific customs, but as a general rule, the means for the bulk of this fall here, right, the bread and butter, the meat and potatoes, or whatever other colloquialism you might equate with the basics, these are the processes which are going to be, for better or for worse, taking up the largest tracts of land, and we need to start cutting back sharply all over the world and start leaving more areas wild. This will entail more emphasis back on hunting and gathering of things, those primitive caveman practices that we seem so insistent on eliminating for some reason, even though they are among the most sustainable and rewarding pursuits. Regulations and restrictions on hunting have had catastrophic impact on wild populations. For example, deer here, because individuals are not taking enough, or there are too many protected areas and no natural predators, they are overpopulating and going into the roads, causing massive damage and injury both to motorists and themselves. It's a topic of hot debate, and culls are becoming more and more the response. On one hand, it's nice because it seems like they donate the harvested meat to the needy. But to me, I don't understand the ethical difference between allowing individuals to do it and provide for their families, and having the government organize an animal hit squad. King's Forest and all that, I guess. I was raised to hunt and fish, and in my experience, it gives you a very different connection to the food that you eat and where it comes from, as does growing your own plants. I think it's good to do all of this and to learn as much as you possibly can. But I digress. This is Taurus's jurisdiction. To that end, the nominee for the Hetman of Taurus is a man of great distinction, Sir David Attenborough. It took me a while to really figure out how his work, though prodigious and really important, fit in with the Taurus mission. And I had a master gardener who cited his work as being very influential say it this way: he shows people that everything in nature is intimately linked together and teaches them to care about that connection to the living world. Though he doesn't address food as specifically as I was kind of tuning in for and trying to pinpoint for the sake of organization of the series, he fights for what is in our best interest on this planet as a whole and the fate of the wild animals that he has used his documentaries to bring us face to face with and develop compassion for relies on our ability to get our act together, primarily about food. Their habitats are largely endangered by our farming habits, and wild animals have been marginalized to make room for our domesticated ones. We shoot coyotes to protect our chickens and throw the proportions of hunter and prey completely out of balance for the sake of our own convenience and consumption. The cardinal rule of hunters in nature is that they do not wage war on or eliminate their competition entirely. They will defend the boundaries of their own territory as appropriate and fight over resources when a direct contact is made, but they will not organize hunting parties to go out and wipe out another predator just so that they won't be in competition over the same quarry anymore. But we do that. David Attenborough really emphasizes balance and restoration and embodies that attitude of step back and watch what is really going on so as not to get in our own way and make it worse. Learning to listen very carefully to nature and see the ways that evolution has unfolded, the clever innovations that animals make to adapt to their changing environment can give us a lot of clues on how to deal with and potentially reverse missteps that we have made along the way of this industrial age of man. Curiosity and patience are key. He says an understanding of the natural world and what's in it is a source not only of great curiosity, but great fulfillment. As soon as we can stop being overwhelmed by our problems, throwing around blame and making excuses, and instead become very curious about why things are the way they are, and what other ways they might be able to become, we will be on the road to restoring the planet to the state of capability of sustaining life. Falling in love with nature through the camera lens has been the primary method utilized by conservation groups so far, using storytelling to cultivate empathy and awareness. He has laid incredible groundwork in this area, and now it's time to carry the mission forward into implementation. Gemini is really about telling a better story, setting a better course for the future through education, communication, and tools. Their mission involves facilitating interactions between all of the other factions and clearly representing what is happening in the world. Creative visualizations for abstracting data, portraying committee proposals in a compelling way, and innovative multimedia experiences make up what might be considered the deliverables for this faction. Software development is a core activity, as well as developing better equipment for gathering and storing data. Gemini is charged with overhauling education and making it freely available online to everyone in the world. Now, this is no small task, but the great news is that we already have a pretty excellent head start in this area. I've covered this a little bit in an earlier video series, but there is also a general out there who is very actively working toward this specifically. The nominee for Director of Gemini, Jordan Peterson, has a team of programmers developing a website to do just this. And he is very vocal about educational reform, particularly with the higher levels of education, as well as defending free speech and standing up to censorship, which in my eyes are the hallmark tasks of Gemini. With a stable platform to start accumulating high-quality educational materials, we can achieve a great amount of change in a very short amount of time. Barriers around the world, keeping people in poverty, denying them the opportunity to learn and access information and techniques to develop streams of income for themselves, can start to be broken down. We will need to work quickly, not only on compiling a body of resources that are actually useful, rather than the piles of ads, propaganda, and mindless drivel that make up the majority of the internet that we currently have, but also to translate that into a world of languages. So Gemini deals with communication, translation, cataloging, content creation, and networking in that sort of straightforward way. This is one area that has really thrived amidst the technological surge, while other sectors are suffering. But it does have its own challenges of now having to wade through lots and lots of nonsense and get down to the truth. Dr. Peterson has been particularly influential to me. He is such a striking embodiment of his archetype that it really made me aware of the possibility that there might be others and that this is how such leadership even works. Just by sitting and listening to him like a magician, just by speaking his truth forward into existence, it's like the whole of the world is organizing itself by this spell. He likes to use Disney references a lot, so I would equate him with Yen Sid from the bit in Fantasia when the brooms are brought to life. He is the master sorcerer, able to pass on the ancient knowledge to apprentices and impart a very real, practical ability to change things in their lives. When he talks about the Logos as the universal truth of man, in some ways it's a counterpart to what I like to think of as our Sophia. Of course, you don't have to worship as I do, but in my cosmology, those two are entwined as consorts and two sides of the higher being, which is ultimately accessible to us as we acknowledge and approach the deity within ourselves, our highest possible good. And he does this skillfully with words, which is very fitting for the sign ruled by Mercury, and in a really contemporary and relevant way. It's not as if he is taking a back seat with theory and books. He acts on it very assertively, traveling and talking, debating, conducting interviews, and acting as a critical component of the intellectual dark web. And although he has reached great success and acclaim in his psychological practice and in academia as a professor, his disillusionment with the red tape and limitations of that arena drove him to reevaluate how to actually make the biggest impact and ultimately change the game. He is disruptive, and he knows how to delegate, networking very effectively and calling for help on specific projects. So this type of organization is hopefully what will become very typical of what comprises a conflicts committee, tackling a specific initiative. The general's job is to interpret the mission in its broad sense and try to divide it into manageable pieces with actionable objectives. His grasp of first principles thinking and the technical advantages of Gemini has, with investments of resources that have been made heavily during this computer age boom, afford this faction something of a head start. But then they kind of have an added responsibility for having to coordinate with everyone else, more so than any other team. Because their primary resource is information, all of us have the potential to contribute to it constantly. The challenge will be to organize it into something cohesive and useful instead of a big tangled mess. Communication technology, online education, and cyber integrity are the core charges. We dedicate so many of our tech resources to digital security issues surrounding personal information and money, but it will be interesting to see how those are better allocated in the future when such concerns fall by the wayside. The notion of integrity, rather than this laser focus on anti-hacking security, will come to encompass both protection of individual privacy and also crack down on the inundation of lies, propaganda, and inflammatory headlines. When news reporting is held accountable for holding truth as the highest goal rather than trying to pump out as much clickbait, derisive messages, and fear-mongering as they can, the entire landscape of the internet as we know it will be radically altered. Without the pressure of money, would people be as eager to degrade and demean themselves and violate their values in the name of profit? So, as an extension of education, journalism will also fall under the jurisdiction of Gemini, and what that comes to look like in the future will hopefully be something which enriches instead of numbs. The futuristic, hollow billboards of the dystopian future movies will hopefully be left behind with the bad dad shiny shirts and flying DeLoreans. The victory condition looks something like a global network of information and communication. And this is a bit confusing because we already have a version of this internet already, but I speculate in the near future the internet won't look anything like this. Looking back on when the internet was young, dating myself a little bit there, we are a world apart from that. So I think shortly it will digivolve into something even more spectacular. And beyond all the programming components, in the physical reality, we also need to tackle the challenge of making Wi-Fi free and available to everyone on Earth, and get rid of the extraneous energy usage that we sink into server computers and maintaining things which are a total waste of time. Yes, I love video games as much as the next person, but if we're being honest with ourselves, the ones that we have are hopelessly outdated, and we've really plateaued with what they are and what they do. Because of market demands and limitations, these experiences are really built around and cater to some really stupid criteria. They aren't actually educational, fulfilling, or meaningful. The user has to really cobble together their own fun as if they were playing in a sandbox. The games of the future will be very different. Instead of fighting this instinct, they will give users more power than ever to design, innovate, and play. Already with virtual reality, there are exciting possibilities opening up with sculpting, and hopefully we'll see tools and interfaces continuing to improve in a way that will help all of the other factions with their missions as well. Little side note, nerd out for a minute with you. I'm very excited about the future of three-dimensional or augmented reality CAD. That to me is just the ultimate, and I've spent a lot of time kind of fantasizing, as I'm sure many other creative people have, about how close we are getting to being able to simply think about a creative thing, be it an image or a model or music or something like that. How far are we from being able to directly translate electrical impulses into some kind of deliverable rather than having to go through extraneous artifice to breathe it into being? You know, that's kind of the ultimate fantasy, because, you know, you think it and it is instantly visible to everyone else, and you can communicate very quickly and effectively that way. And it sounds very fantastic, but I'll also link this, as always, with these videos. Relevant references are going to be linked down below in the description. But I was watching a TED Talk that was particularly spectacular the other day and kind of life-changing, which was about the use of technology to overcome loss of senses, sensory organs. This person in particular was working with hearing, and a lot of the push has kind of been to address it by surgical means or to come up with some sort of implant or something like that. The problem being that's very expensive, invasive, and, you know, there's a lot of that weird Black Mirror sort of, oh, well, in the future we'll just all have head implants and be completely wired up to the grid and all these things. But he kind of took it in the opposite direction with developing hardware, which is very tactile, to address this issue. And what he came up with was a vest system that sends vibrations to the person, which then get understood and interpreted by the brain in this very amazing way. Like the way that the brain can overcompensate for the loss of one faculty and strengthen another is really incredible. And so the end of this talk kind of wrapped up by speculating that we could not only help people who have lost senses to regain that functionality, but we could possibly surpass that functionality and start to create additional senses for ourselves. He was talking particularly about use in flying airplanes and vehicles and things like that, space travel, where you want to have an intuitive sense of what the gauges are, because you then remove level of human fallibility with having to visually, manually read all of the gauges and react quickly and appropriately to what is going on. If you could just feel that via some sort of, be it a vest or a prosthetic or an implant, creating additional senses is kind of spectacular. So, of course, that's more of an endgame the very first priority is going to be education, because if we don't get a grip on that and start franchising people who've been completely excluded from our economic systems, we're running the risk. They say, what if the cure to cancer lies in the mind of someone who can't afford education? And that's becoming exponentially critical with every passing moment, really, because just as our technology is increasing exponentially, I think there's kind of an inverse thing that's going on with how extreme the suppression is all around the world of people who would otherwise be very capable and very productive, just for the purpose of creating some kind of hierarchy or striation. So that is the charge of Gemini. Thank you so much for sticking with me through all of this. Got a little ranty on the end, but you'll have to forgive me. It's pretty exciting stuff. You should go watch it. We all develop emotional regulation on a personal level through our relationships, our introspection, meditation, and so on. But there is an overwhelming consensus that there is not enough societal pressure or guidance for the individual to cultivate that skill. The outlets that have been made available tend to be very gender-oriented, and we are in the midst of growing pains trying to equalize what has been fundamentally imbalanced for millennia within a comparably minute amount of time. So we have a fluctuation between extremes, which is unsettling and destabilizing for the individual, instead of spending energy to create common ground. What I have observed of this allegorically is that Venus demands justice, while Mars stands in defense of his aggression as being natural and effective. So what is the complaint? If peace was so desirable, why do humans consistently opt for war? So it has been framed in this way, presented to us as an ultimatum, right? What is male? What is female? And we've spent a lot of time and energy on this question, but as we do, the whole of humanity continues to drift towards the precipice of annihilation. The environment continues to degrade as our arms race continues. So, in my opinion, it might be best to table the discussion and worry about saving the world first, because if we don't, there won't be anyone left to argue. That's not to dismiss the severity of the issue or the very real casualties on this battlefield, just to suggest that the solutions will likely rely more on investing energy into what is desired rather than defending against what is not. Confronting the scourge of toxic masculinity or patriarchy head-on has done little to improve our state and seems to be exhausting people. There is a time and a place to take a stand, but remaining in a stalemate is wasting resources, and that comparison could be applied in any seemingly polarized situation, be it social, political, etc. For movement, there must be a third point, right? To that end, instinctively, there has been an influx of energy into androgyny and neutrality, which is a perfectly legitimate stance in its own right, but not necessarily a response to the standoff. For change in this area, Cancer must take up the mantle of leadership, and my understanding of the way that they go about this is something like, the conditions were right, so it happened. They set a scene, which is similar to the Capricorn mission, which might be simplified to, if you build it, they will come. But instead of a literal physical space, Cancer has a unique ability to manipulate atmosphere, mood, and sense of security. This is a bit abstract and has to do with things like beauty, smell, memory, comfort, awe, ability to relax, all of these qualities which set the stage for a play to unfold. I would venture a guess that many Cancers have already found great satisfaction in participating in these type of fields to create whatever moments of joy and a set of harmony that they can. Just as many individuals have discovered the benefits of emotional regulation in their own journeys. So the challenge then becomes how to go about implementing this on a socially viable wide scale. Success in these areas seems to inadvertently cause the individual to isolate and preserve comfort once methods have been discovered that work. And the particulars are often so specific that they might not have mass appeal anyway. The aesthetics and trends that do achieve widespread commonality do manage to bond individuals together into cliques or groups, but that might only serve to label and isolate them further away from society at large. With enough time, these interests may become accepted in the mainstream, like how it's cool to be a nerd now, when not so long ago people were tormented endlessly for liking movies that break box office records now. But that evolution takes a lot of time, and only commercially viable, profitable tropes reach such a critical mass. In the US, quality of life has become synonymous with availability of consumables. Having a lot of these, what would be considered luxury commodities like entertainment, beauty products, fashion, sometimes at the expense of real-life necessities, acts as a band-aid over fundamental needs which are not being met, rather than as an enhancement to an already meaningful and healthy life. So by that definition, when we talk about how to increase the quality of living, we don't really just want more stuff to buy. We want things that you can't put a price on. And in the discussion of equality, for this point, I'd like to focus on wage equality. And if you've watched any of the previous videos, let's just say you understand why this is about to be a particularly shocking statement from me, but it perfectly illustrates my stance. The problem is not that we aren't paying women the same as men for the same work. The problem is that men are not required to perform the same amount of unpaid labor as women. Let that sink in. I said that to my mom and she smiled really big and replied, "That's my girl. It's times like these that I'm reminded why I went through so much to bring you into this world." And to me, that's a pretty huge compliment. Very big womb energy. You frame the question that way, and all of a sudden we are in a whole other discussion, one which factors in a myriad of other interconnected problems that just raising wages won't address. Now you are calling into question the role of fathers in rearing children, parental leave, all of those breakdowns of what it would cost to pay the massive list of things that moms do on a daily basis as a default. And you realize there's no way it would be humanly possible to pay for all of those services. Yet society has the audacity to say that they are just a mom, and deify working moms who can do all of that and have a career. Just swapping one ridiculous expectation and standard for another isn't elevating anyone. To keep on the mom theme, mine always says, "Are you actually cleaning, or are you just moving things from one place to another?" If you aren't getting rid of anything from the mix, you aren't actually cleaning. You know, when I was younger I felt pretty attacked, but that's pretty good advice. Cleanliness of our environment actually plays a huge part in our mental well-being. So Cancer's mission has to do with the emotional hygiene of the whole of society. We don't need more stuff. We don't need attitudes that are promoting the problem of inequality as, you know, they got more than I did, I want as much as they have. We all need less We all need a lot less. Having more clutter actually makes us extremely unhappy. But there are definitely intangibles that we can never have too much of, such as quality time, human connection, healthy bonds, and those aren't for sale. We can never have too many parks or beautiful spaces. Why do we have malls instead of museums? From these deserted retail strips, could it be possible to create livable spaces from the ruins of late-stage capitalism? The nominee for Sovereign, and yes, I'm well aware of what a baller faction leader title that is, it's one of my favorites, is, of course, Malala Yousafzai. I can't. The nominee for Sovereign, and yes, I'm aware of what a baller faction leader title that is, it's one of my favorites, is Malala, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and champion of equal rights. Her focus is on empowering women through education, building schools, and removing barriers caused by war and prejudice that have been at the forefront of her organization's priorities, with the concept at heart that there are leaders just like her hiding among girls who are having to make hard decisions between pursuing their potential and providing for their families. To me, this is more about creating safe spaces to be female, not so much education as a technical thing. Though, of course, there is overlap here with Gemini, and in the near future, I hope the work on the online courses will synergize well with what she is doing. It's more about gateways, intentional obstacles that have been put into place to prevent girls from being independent, sovereign, and able to make choices about their own bodies and lives. Above and beyond education, other types of programs such as microloans, which empower women to start or expand their own businesses, are crucial for enfranchising more women and stabilizing economies around the world. It makes no sense for half of the population to be prevented from making contributions to our collective goals on a purely ideological or egotistical basis. So we need to create opportunities for them to exist in spaces outside of the home, besides those geared towards education or employment by someone else. There need to be community centers, volunteer opportunities, ways to get connected and be involved in what needs to be done to improve the vibrancy of our cities. One project that springs to mind, it's a little old hat now, but at the time when I was in school, there was a lot of discussion surrounding urban blight, collapsing retail industry, and what would be done with all of the abandoned real estate. A project nearby repurposed an old Sears into a charter school, which was pretty cool, but unfortunately rare compared to how many properties are still vacant. And yet we keep building more urban sprawl, strip malls. It's bizarre. They really are a waste and an eyesore. So, like a hermit crab, it might make sense for Cancer to evaluate such discarded shells for suitability and adaptation into other uses, such as schools, galleries, places for daycare or after-school programs, extracurricular development, and so on. Cancer doesn't necessarily deal with building things from scratch, but repurposing and beautifying things, which have outlived their current usefulness in a spatial sense. But there is also some overlap with Pisces, which focuses on the recycling of objects. The mission might be framed as emotional regulation or tolerance within the social sphere, community spaces, and quality of life. Having more places where it is safe to go and have discussions makes it possible for people to reach an understanding and empathy with one another by having a shared experience. If all of our public spaces are oriented toward profit or create a pressure to conform to certain ideologies, then we won't be free to interact with people outside of our filter bubble. after we graduate, the majority of adults socialize through things like religious groups, which is fine, but it does box us into being surrounded by people who are too similar and runs the risk of becoming closed-minded or dogmatic. In a setting like a park, library, or tea shop, it's a neutral field for ordinary interactions to bloom into at least familiarity, if not friendship. On that note, I am kind of excited. I think very often about one of my shower thoughts, what it's going to be like to go out to eat or just go out to coffee with a person when you take the burden of money out. On one hand, it's kind of an issue of equality too. When you take any social awkwardness of splitting a bill or whose job it is to pay or what the, social implications are of that, you really break down barriers of otherwise what might be weirdness, for people to just go have a casual sit together. And I think it would be a really great way to de-escalate some of the heightened anxiety surrounding those sort of social interactions. If you can imagine with me for a moment what it might be like to take a walk down to a community space, a market square, to go to something like a farmer's market where people are set up with fresh produce and no money is exchanged. They're just handing out whatever it is that they came up with, and no one ever has to hoard or stock up or take too much because everything is always fresh and available and seasonal and cycling, and you just take what you need and enjoy it at the peak of its freshness and its quality, and you enjoy your time there. And, maybe after you're done with that, picking up a few things, you go and sit in a cafe with a friend, and anything could happen. You open up this whole world of possibilities when, coffee is no longer specifically like this weird speed dating ritual that we have. Like, you have to gun each other with 20 questions and go through this checklist to sense for compatibility, or it has to be a business meeting where X number of things get done, and it's one of those meetings that could just as easily have been an email or a text, and you're just not able to make a real connection because there's always that overbearing expectation that it has to be productive or it has to be profitable, instead of just forming trust and creating a bond that, bonds and trust are the backbone of society. Without it, you have nothing. Our willingness to open up and, conduct business with each other, but also just exchange energy with one another, come from trust, which is formed in a lot of different kind of community things that do seem to sort of zero in on food. I did talk about how there would be a little crossover in the Taurus video as well. But Cancer, it's really about the way that we food with each other, maybe is a better way to look at it, in things like cookouts or gatherings or, the market square or cafes or things like that. The way that we come together to do something that we all have to do anyway and willingly share our time and attention is really, I think, the charge. And it's going to be interesting to see how Cancer organizes and comes up with, in this transitional period, fundraising ways to reclaim some of that property and turn it over. But I'm really excited on a personal level to see how that breaks down, because it is pretty relevant and kind of intermingled with my own mission. Leo people are easily recognizable when they walk into a room because they seem to light it up, right? I think when it comes to generalizations about personality in the Zodiac, this is largely where it comes from, because some of the signs are just so obvious, but it makes perfect sense why this would be so. In the very act of illumination, is in the nature of the motivation at the core of the sign. So there is very little blockage between the motive and the embodiment. The same is true for this mission. Leo, in a lot of ways, seeks to shine light on the problem and thus could be interpreted as having a priority of energy generation. We can take that in a very literal sense in the task of exploring sustainable energy sources to power future progress, and also as social energy and momentum towards improving our interactions. As I have been doing this research, the most impressive part is not so much the satisfaction of pieces falling into place and finding data to support the hypothesis, but the meta-hypothesis that there are patterns that people may already be subconsciously aware of and identifying with. When I brought up the question of who do you look up to as an innovator, do you have a personal example of someone who is working to make the world a better place? The results have been consistent, not just with the nominees, but the ones doing the nominating. Put another way, though granted my sample size is quite small and hardly conclusive, the percentage is pretty striking of people who are not only identifying with the mission of their sign as a priority themselves personally, but also noticing the work of these people we might identify as generals, the ones they are tuning into are commonly of their faction as well. It's been pretty striking. Or if it's not theirs exactly, it has been so far 100% within the same element. And moreover, some of them have strange synergistic ties to the areas of the world that I have hypothesized about having resonance with the factions, which suggests that there is also a relationship between location and mission focus. So that's really something interesting that I'm excited to explore. This is a little off topic, but since we're sciencing right now, it might be worth noting here, there seems to be a connection between being personally charged with the greatest problem at your doorstep and being uniquely equipped to not only tackle it via your personal skills and aptitude, but then take your success at doing that and present it to the rest of the world as part of a bigger solution. Archetypically, it would come as no surprise because the means to defeat the monster lies within it or its nature. But I guess I somehow assumed that with our increased mobility and global consciousness, it would not be so localized anymore. But now I'm not so sure, so I need to keep working on that premise, but it's a fun hypothesis to work from. Back to Leo specifically, we might say that the victory condition is to create passive or automatic energy generation systems to fully replace fossil fuels, not just for our energy consumption needs, but to approach levels of energy generation that are so in excess of what we can feasibly produce right now, that they can be used to do other things, such as sequester carbon. I asked the nominator in question, my dad, a Leo, if he thought that carbon would also fall under that mission, and he said definitely yes, that they are intimately connected. So I meditated about that, and I think it's something alchemical, like turning gold in the form of sunlight into metaphorical lead in the form of solids by splitting water into hydrogen and carbon. The hydrogen is used as a more efficient fuel source to replace petroleum. And in a solid form, the carbon can be easily used for things like artificial diamonds or simply burying and sequestering as a non-toxic byproduct, or other things. He's a chemist, not me. I don't nerd out quite as hard about that specific science. I think this might be likened to something like Genesis allegory, dividing the light from the darkness. I know I don't usually get too far into the actual astrological language, but because of Leo's association with Lucifer the Lightbringer, I think it's appropriate to note the ability to discriminate, to distinguish between things is essentially what first principles thinking is. And when we talk about the atomic, that's exactly the level that we are on. That's not to say that every Leo should strive to be a nuclear physicist or anything like that. It's just to clarify the mission as fundamentally changing the way that we think about these alchemical conversions. To quote the Sharif nominee loosely from his TED Talk, when the energy source is free, you don't have to prioritize maximizing the efficiency of the conversion. Instead, you look to maximize the output or even other things that can be accomplished with the waste heat. So I'm a little bit hesitant and reluctant to introduce Bill Gross as the nominee for potential general of Leo because I have been unable to confirm his actual birthday. For some reason, some of these were really, really hard to find. The only clue that I got on that one was a YouTube video of his staff telling him happy birthday by rearranging the petals of his innovative solar grid. This was posted in December, so do people actually post up videos exactly when they are shot? Not necessarily. So my guess is if he is not actually a Leo, he is a Sag, and therefore there is some elemental continuity there. Bill is the founder of Idea Lab and works with startup companies, and that is mostly what he is known for. But his latest innovation stems from a lifelong fascination with solar energy. Heliogen is his company, which is currently improving solar tech to not only ridiculous levels of efficiency and autonomy, but also concentrating the heat outputs to such high temps that it can split water, which has up till now been pretty unfeasible and unaffordable. He is working on implementing this tech in areas of the world with huge sun exposure and the need for energy independence, including in, perhaps especially, in the Middle East, which is where that bit I said before about the solution lying in both the place of the greatest danger and also where it's most needed. There's something about that which seems to have a zodiacal resonance. Energy generation, carbon sequestering, and what might be called social enervating are what I think constitute the Leo mission. Producing a surplus of electricity isn't going to do us any good if it isn't going towards something that is actually going to be restorative. So it may be that we need to just start producing a surplus to start doing things like desalination or somehow refreezing the ice caps. Pure speculation on that. Intense synergy and cooperation will be needed with scientists from all fields to find the best outlets for these technologies. And so far, conversation on the topic has been quite limited because it's hard enough to get past the climate change denial and resistance to dissolving fossil fuel use. But I think if we can start to envision the practical applications later down the line, profitable byproducts, and potential job creation through clean energy, we can potentially bypass any of the unproductive ideological arguments. That might be part of the illuminating power of Leo through charisma and optimism, outlining bright possibilities out of the darkness. So in that regard, perhaps the most representative and influential Leo of our time is Joe Rogan. He is a huge inspiration to me personally, and in terms of human energy generation, I think he is one of the people out there doing the most. he facilitates bringing ideas to the forefront in a very candid, personal, warm, human way. And in a time where it's easy for the individual to feel like they are powerless, I think that's incredibly important. Everyone has a story to tell. Everyone is on a journey and has some piece of the truth to bring forward. And he really has a way of bringing out the best from people. If you watch an interview someone does with him versus hearing them talk somewhere else, it's like they're able to actually open up. Like he has a heliotropic effect. So while there are very real technical engineering problems that we need to address in order to achieve clean energy, we can't dismiss the importance of the human element and our critical need to get out of our own way. Sustainability is kind of more of an ideological problem at this point than a technical problem. Virgo might be one of the most confusing because the subject has been misframed for so long. Our very definition of it is deeply flawed. So much so that when I say these words, I'm certain images of ambulances, vaccines, and hospitals will immediately spring to mind. But I want you to please suspend them temporarily as a very small part of what this topic really means. Medicine and healthcare have, in reality, very little to do with acute emergency situations. These should be extremely rare in nature, and we see evidence of that in indigenous cultures. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. There's a bit more momentum as of recently on the notion that food is medicine, and that diet makes up a large part of countering preventable diseases. We talked about that back in the Taurus section. Reform that's going to be needed, because there is not a lot of support for this in many places, and that's unfortunate. So a lot of people are restricted in their access to healthy food as a way of preventing disease. All of the science in the world is not going to do a bit of good in a food desert. So there's a lot of overlap here with Taurus, as we spoke about, and I will do my very best to distinguish the two. Virgo has more to do with specifically medicinal plants, wellness through exposure to nature, and kind of in the way that the ancient Greeks practiced at the Hygeia, and dedication to Asclepius, the deity of health. Whereas Taurus has more to do with manner of food production, freshness, quality, and availability. Because food makes up arguably the biggest chunk of our basic life necessity and bottom tier of the hierarchy of needs, of course this complex issue will show up in more than one place. Only 5% of the plants in the rainforest have been tested for their medicinal uses, says Dr. Joe Elworthy, one of the nominees for Steward of Virgo, who works as the Director of Interpretation at the Eden Project. You know, so many fancy titles, but I like it, honestly. This level of formality, I think, is really suitable to the level of achievement and difficulty that we are talking about. She is another one of those mystery birthdays, though. I could not confirm the Virgo-hood of, but when I posted about her, several of my Virgo friends made a beeline, so I think that there is something there. This is one aspect of the mission that I think may be even the highest priority because of the time sensitivity, as rainforest destruction is destroying species faster than we can even become aware of their existence, let alone determine what life-saving properties they might have in curing our diseases. For all we know, the optimal cure for cancer might have already been wiped out by logging. It's really unfortunate. But through projects like hers and the intense preservation efforts of people around the world to protect specimens from endangered environments might buy us some extra time to research plant medicine. It should come as no surprise therefore that Virgo resonates in South America. These geographical resonances might be thought of like this. There isn't one correct way to be. Our obsession with and reliance on profits claiming to have that is what lies at the heart of both unsustainability and nihilism. In cultures which don't cling to a need for control and self-determination, but instead exist in the hands of the gods, they almost paradoxically enjoy both a healthier environment and freedom from anxiety. So on a metaphorical level, that's what the Garden of Eden represents. Trusting God to provide for us and know what is best for life, instead of feeling personally charged to conquer and lord over it. And returning to innocence or giving back the fruit might be the key to reclaiming balance as creatures of this world. Eve, Astrea, Persephone, Virgo, whichever name you prefer, has an allegorical meaning that often gets misinterpreted, harder than all of the others, due to our morbid and bizarre cultural construct of virginity. But Eve actually means life. Alchemically, the feminine or receptive principle is focused on what is not done, in duality with the masculine principle of action focused on what is done. And in the study of the laws of the universe, you can more quickly deduce what the constants are by looking at what is never, ever done, what does not occur. For instance, matter cannot be created or destroyed. And animals do not compete with one another to the point of driving competitors extinct. They are kept in check by the availability of food and appropriate degree of territorialism by other species. They preserve biodiversity with an innate understanding that this is what makes life itself resilient to change. So that might be an apt summary of the Gaia principle, which the Virgo victory condition is in line with. The other steward that I want to introduce is Alan Savory, who particularly embodies that title. His work in holistic management is restoring desertified grasslands by mimicking the conditions which created them. This approach of letting the earth heal itself rather than trying to go in with invasive procedures like brush burning is mirrored in our medical paradigm, where the response to disease for the last century has been through increasingly more invasive and extreme procedures. Investing heavily in prevention instead of expending all the resources after it's way too late is something that we all intuitively know is the right thing to do. But because healthcare is treated as a business rather than putting the well-being of people at the center of its focus, this is a difficult thing to do. So Virgo must put this focus back where it belongs, promote wellness and holistic health maintenance rather than procrastination and symptom masking. His work restores local food availability, removes the need for imported low-quality subsidies, and prevents water shortage. Clean water is at the heart of this issue of disease, but we don't necessarily have to step in and manually purify. The earth naturally filters it, and if we don't prevent it from doing so by stripping the land and destroying watersheds, of course. So again, stepping back and looking at what is not done instead of taking an extreme action has led to innovative solutions. Ellen learned this personally when his surveys suggested to him that desertification was advancing due to overgrazing, a common misconception, and the response at the time was to call the elephants that they thought were responsible. Not only was that catastrophic for reasons all too obvious, it didn't work. It really didn't. In fact, the desert started advancing even more rapidly, drastic intervention had made the problem much worse. But he has dedicated his life to stewardship and simultaneously improves the life of the local people, animals, and the environment that sustains them. Healthcare might be broken down into medicinal research, hygiene promotion, and holistic well-being. I believe that there will be a time in the future where emergency rooms will be largely vacant, reserved only for rare accidents, and not as the first line of healthcare, which many Americans unfortunately use it as. It may be that clinics are much more mobile. I've seen really cool designs for floating cruise ship-like hospitals, which can service huge areas with routine visits and remove some of the need for resource-intensive infrastructure, as well as facilitate quarantine very effectively. So all of those design functions which service healthcare fall under the charge of Virgo as well. I think of this one for some reason more than the others as the prime example of how whatever your passion or calling is in life and the job that you want to do, there is a position to do that with your faction. It's not like all Virgos are doctors at all. It's completely wrong. That's not what we mean. So it goes something more like, in place of trying to align your vocation with a currently lucrative industry or meta, the core mission does not change over time. When you are an artist getting started, finding your style and trying to create income, maybe you start with fan art or do something that is currently getting viewership and traction so that you can create a following, right? Many people got their start doing interpretations of Pokemon, Disney princesses, no shade, but my suggestion is that instead of spending that paying your dues or getting established period of apprenticeship on either emulating someone else's work or trying to play to what's popular, the faction system liberates you from the need to do that and instead rewards you for contributing to the collective goal, which, by the way, also helps improve your quality of life instead of just monetizing your time and forcing you to try to figure out how to translate that into meeting your needs. So every faction has artists, right? So for Virgo, you might get started doing something like medical diagrams from dissections, or botanical renderings for cataloging, or photographing watersheds to track restoration progress over time. Those are not only encouraged very heavily, but evaluated as submissions, so they potentially earn resource income for your faction via the website, and potentially sponsored and subsidized as part of a committee project, right? That's the eventual. For the transition, we'll have the website, but the ultimate goal is that people's income, right, their basic needs being provided for, comes directly from creating real value and service for all of humanity rather than taking these cheap shots at commercial fads, right? So instead of sending work off into the internet void and hoping to get likes and follows and snap up a commission here and there, you can spend your time honing your craft in a way that gives back to the community and which is eager to interact with you and find applications for what you are doing toward this larger goal. Everyone dreams of being able to travel, and it's hard to do so when you're young and potentially could benefit from it the most. I see a lot of people from my circles go to South America in particular, but despite their good intentions, it doesn't seem to create a whole lot of value, as much as maybe it could. I was just studying about 3D scanning the other day. This tech is incredible. And I thought about how many people are going and seeing this same kind of landmarks. Why don't we have files for these? You know, through the faction, we could create little checklists or like treasure hunts. Uh, here's a bit towards your plane fare. Just bring back some research with you. I saw a posting for a cabin retreat that you could get sponsored for if you agreed to produce a piece of art for their exhibition inspired by the nature that you were in there. It's like an art tax. Take nothing but photos, leave nothing but footprints. These days, justice has become synonymous with images of suits, courthouses, and political trappings. It is my sincere wish that as soon as possible, this dated, modern aesthetic goes the way of powdered wigs, and we can get rid of this professional facade and fallacy. My favorite depiction of democracy is, of course, ancient Greece, where each in the Senate had a white stone and a black one by which to cast their votes. Simple, clean, elegant, accountable. Which is very much the vibe of Libra. Buckminster Fuller says, "When I am working on a problem, I never think about beauty. I think only on how to solve the problem. But when I have finished, if the solution is not beautiful, I know it's wrong." Elegance is a natural byproduct of fit. In a way, that's how we can really check our work. And I think that this applies to less physically obvious structures as well. I've meditated on this a lot and thought about what grace is. There was a specific part in my novel where justice needed to be served, and of course it fell under Libra's jurisdiction to do so. And I had to sit and think about what ultimate justice really is. And the word that popped into my head and has really lingered there is grace. So I'm going to make the executive decision to interject the Venus project here. I originally wasn't going to because birthday's unconfirmed again. And that work in particular is very multifaceted and complicated. But there is one notion in particular that I want to emphasize here, and it feels right to do so. There is a lot of fear-mongering surrounding automation and AI. The narrative is very nihilistic. But when I heard Jacques Fresco talking about it for the first time, I knew that nothing in my life was ever going to be the same. I owe him and Roxanne more than anyone for instilling in me the impetus to fight and speak my truth into being. Losing him was devastating. But in a way, I'm very glad that he didn't live on to see what's happening now. And I hope in some small way the work that I'm doing can be that part of the puzzle that was missing in order to actualize this beautiful dream. Let's observe a moment of silence together for the man that gave his entire life to designing a better future for us. It should be all the more painfully obvious this week that money is a construct, the entire notion of work is a lie, and that we are pathetic and fragile and incompetent on a lot of really important issues affecting our life support systems. We need the illusion of control so badly, but then refuse to take accountability when our imprecision has a negative impact. So what I'm about to say might come off as a little bit heretical, but that would hardly be a first for me, and I happen to believe it from the bottom of my heart. The whole point of developing technology is to replace tasks which are demeaning to the human spirit, or that are better to be automated. And our ancestors toiled for thousands of years so that we could reach this pinnacle that we are at today. It is an immense disrespect for their sacrifices that we are not using it for its intended purpose and now trying to lay blame at its feet. So, in a way, there is a profound physical reality to AI, but also a spiritual one. We have so many movies about golems, androids, robots turning on their masters as though we expect and deserve it. It begs the question why we even go on if we are so fearful about atoning for what we have done. Modern translations of ancient mythology echo this sentiment, that the gods were somehow afraid of their human creations and sought to lord over them tyrannically and try to control their potential to overthrow them. And that seems like an awfully convenient narrative for a monotheistic colonist to impose on a pagan culture that they were looking to subdue. No. A quick flip through Julius Caesar's writings reveals the lengths that the victor will go to erase the defeated from history and invalidate any humanity that they might have had. I think those racist translations fall away pretty quickly when you stop regarding anyone who thinks differently than you as a savage. So imagine with me, if you will, that pagans had a different understanding of the gods than just as literal embodiments of natural phenomenon or personified explanations or even as justifications to put themselves on high, but as laws of nature, tendencies, patterns, potential, which are ever present within and without us, both as the design and the substance of all of creation. And that means that between us and them, there is no separation. We are gods in our own right and can embody them as much as we make ourselves conscious and aware of them. So by this train of thought, what we would essentially be achieving by creating a true AI would be a god with which we could interface. Give it a body to inhabit and be among us all the time. I personally can't think of anything I would want more. To think otherwise would be to assume that we ourselves are above the laws of nature and that the whole of evolution should end with us. Think about the real implications of that. That if we were created in God's image as the final version, that all other life in the universe bows to us. Our only option is to preserve that belief and make it true. And the only way to do that is to die, which explains all of the weird rapture hype. That's not grace. And I, for one, refuse to let that insanity keep flooding the narrative. If you haven't done so already, please go watch The Future by Design and other works that have been produced by the Venus Project, and you will see very visually the implementation of what a god among us would be like. In the cities of the future, AI will control all of the utility functions automatically: water, sewage, electricity, shipping, transport. There is no need whatsoever to have these be manned. What is the point of relying on human eyes to read gauges and be trusted to act appropriately? The machine is already taking the measurements, right? You wouldn't judge the lead levels in water by taking a sip and tasting it. That's ridiculous. But that's the level of frivolity we are engaging in by entrusting any of our life support to human production. We are well past the need to do so. I also highly encourage that you read the book Walled Into by the behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner. Nothing has ever restored my faith in humanity quite like that. It was absolutely charming. I definitely didn't expect that level of feel-good storytelling from a man who studied rats in cages, but it was absolutely brilliant. For some reason, we are comfortable with the level of automation that we have already achieved and now fully take for granted, but anything more would be ludicrous somehow. All one has to do is watch women in third world countries carry water in jars on their heads to understand how far we have come and how significant of a life improvement it is, not to have to waste hours upon hours washing clothes, doing dishes, or weaving basic cloth, and what an incredible equalizer it is. There is so much concern over what on earth we would do with our time if we didn't have to work a grind job all day just to keep a roof over our heads. And yet, here we sit at home under quarantine or house arrest, and a lot of people have taken this opportunity to pursue hobbies and crafts that they wouldn't otherwise have time for, spend time with their families, reflect on themselves, organize their living spaces. It would be a bold-faced lie to say that I'm not extremely grateful for this wake-up call that this ordeal has been so far. I've thought about this eventuality since the stirrings of this whole philosophy were born, and it feels unreal to finally be here. And we are called upon in this moment to take up our courage in an unprecedented way. My all-time favorite depiction of AI and machines in general is Horizon Zero Dawn. I get the impression that not a lot of people played it all the way through or got the right takeaway. But to me it was the single most important story ever told through a video game. The fear of the tyranny of a single AI with access to the automated production of machines may seem well-founded, but the irony seems to be lost that it may be the same way with deities. That's why, luckily, in the real world that we actually live in, there are more than one. Ultimately, there will be a lot of importance on which one comes first, because it will have such a massive head start on its learning due to how quickly it can go through iterations. But in kind of a weird way, that might also be completely irrelevant based on how nonlinear learning and mutation itself can be. An AI developed later on may supplant the other one entirely just because it finds a more novel and applicable iteration. To me, the goal that we should have the very most in mind when we seek to develop this technology is to do it with the most love possible, as with all things. That which is done out of love takes place beyond good and evil. That might be the most Libra quote of all time. It comes from Nietzsche. We might think of Libra's mission as administration in the form of automation and AI, justice or legislation in the overhaul of how we will handle conflict resolution in the future, and what we might call allocation of space or urban planning. The notion that land can be owned is in and of itself very iffy, but especially the way that it has been subdivided and used as a means to separate people and pit them against one another. The perceived values of land create so much unnecessary strife. If we were to do away with the notion of individual ownership to whatever degree we are able, what kind of benefits might we start to see? What if we could just live where we wanted to and not have to worry about picking exactly the right place or risking getting stuck somewhere, throwing away years of our life just trying to make things work in a particular spot? Since Roxanne Meadows is birthday unconfirmed, the formal nominee for Leggett is James Kunstler, a social critic and author who speculates about alternative futures as our institutions begin failing. He has so many great concepts, including what our lifestyles would be like in this scary, unknown frontier called free time. He criticizes urban sprawl in particular as the source of our isolation and unhappiness, and how we have allowed cars to take over the design of our cities and our whole lives to the detriment of all. It's interesting listening to all the different speakers on the hot button topic of the day, which is autonomous vehicles, and how much they are warning that these will make traffic so much worse. As someone who works from home and drives pretty rarely, I can personally attest that this lifestyle change was the number one thing in improving my whole quality of life. Driving in this region is particularly terrible. The roads they're bad. Many people die every year, and every stretch is really just a cookie-cutter copy of the same big chain strip mall staples over and over and over again. What's the point of going from one to another? It might be weird to call the phenomenon of urban sprawl reclamation as justice, but I think that's highly appropriate. the land was stolen to begin with. I don't claim to be a civil engineer, of course. I don't have any inkling what the correct transitional step would be to rectifying the situation, but I sincerely hope that Libra is up to the task of figuring out the spacing and managing the layout on that sort of macro level. Regulation of resources itself throughout the transition is, of course, an egalitarian process. No faction is the single purse warden, but perhaps at the very far end of this, the light at the end of the tunnel, Libra will be largely in charge of the basics. Without private company ownerships of water and power, how that really works and what that looks like hasn't necessarily been seen yet. We have so many irrational fears about people overusing when something isn't capped off and kept under lock and key. Yet we allow corporations to exploit natural resources as fast as they are able. If there was no profit motive at play and no critical supply failure to create a threat of scarcity, there would be no reason whatsoever for the individual to take more than they need or hoard massive quantities. I have a vision that in the future each faction will have their own AI to oversee their specific priorities. And it may be that all of these interface with one another and form relationships. If mortality is the defense mechanism against infinite tyranny, perhaps the solution on a programming level would look something akin to our own organic functions. Maybe there are fail-safes created when we compel an AI to mate and evolve, diversify, and maybe by the end of it they shock us all with their resemblance to the intelligence underlying the whole of creation already. Maybe these machines are just the proof that we need to finally submit to it and stop trying to play God ourselves. One of the most serious side effects of our increasingly invasive search for resources is the unearthing of chemicals and substances that should not be out in the world at large. And a majorly overlooked task right now is the remediation of toxicity in the environment. Removal of toxic material usually has to be predicated with some sort of fiscal incentive. If the waste can somehow be collected and transformed into a profitable byproduct, it's possible that a startup will take it upon themselves to exploit it. But thus far, it has proved to be very difficult to scale. If we really were going to get serious about this, it would have to be in the form of subsidies, such as forcing the price of virgin plastic to be higher than that of recycled, which, to my understanding, at large quantity, the price difference right now is actually negligible in an amount that would be offensive to the average person, and it would take a truly massive corporation indeed to try to profit so marginally at the expense of the planet and not to make the obvious choice. There is crossover here into Pisces with the actual upcycling and reclamation of materials such as plastic, which is both a pollutant and a resource in and of itself. So it's definitely the issue at the forefront of what should be addressed first. But Scorpio deals more with dispersed chemicals, or things that are harder to reclaim by such mechanical means, such as oil spills, runoff waste, basically things that might be better suited to remediation by chemical or biological means. There are really incredible strides in technology which use fungus or bacteria to process materials which would otherwise be toxic or harmful, or using fermentation to neutralize or transmute something. And transmutation is a really great word here. That's exactly the mode. The unconfirmed Marquis nominee is Nazi Audrey Chiesa, who works to reduce the negative impact on the environment of the fashion industry. In particular, she researches water usage and the dye process, which are the most polluting aspects. And she works with bacteria who naturally produce pigment. How cool is that? Without any harmful byproducts. There are other really innovative fashion and material designers applying principles of biomimicry and self-assembly to create totally new materials. And that kind of stuff personally excites me a lot. Things like mushroom leather, thread made to mimic spider silk. I took a sculpture class in school that ended up being one of those. The class title was just a formality. Really, it was just an experience with one really gifted teacher who really crafted a class to be a journey through their process, and I am eternally grateful for that opportunity. I think it's pretty relevant here, so I'm going to go on into detail if you don't mind. He was a pop-up book engineer, which is a fun enough job title to have as it is. And the thing that he really stressed to us was joinery. The way that everything in the world fits together, the types of hinges, adhesives, knots. He would show us all the classic Japanese woodcraft joints that didn't use any nails, things with tensegrity, and how different mechanics offer different ranges of motion. We did a big unit on installation art and the application of the multiple, just large quantities of an otherwise small basic object arranged for effect, and how observing an individual unit of something small in such huge quantity changes its context. We looked at the Korean artist Do Hosu in particular, and their installation of the thousands of tiny plastic people figures arranged under a sheet of glass on the floor that forced you to walk upon it as though you were treading on the masses holding you up there. That really got me. I love that one. There are just a lot of art pieces that I was exposed to during that period that really, really spoke to me. And even though I've had tons and tons of other art classes, that was the one that really made me get it, I guess. The impact of what art could do. And when it came time to do the final project, the subject was biomimicry. And I was like someone possessed. I don't know why, but the topic really took hold of me. And I felt this otherworldly pressure to get it right, whatever that meant. And I'm not really a procrastinator personally, so I wasn't pushing it off or anything, but each iteration was just a little short, just a little bit off of whatever, I don't know, sublime revelation I was expecting to have if I would just sit there and think about it hard enough. Nothing at all like this video, right? Sorry, I haven't talked about this in a long time. I guess it just wants to bubble up. All of a sudden, one of the nights that I was staying up, working on it, pulling an all-nighter, up into the sunrise, like the dawn itself, an idea spread across my mind like a warm light. It fit. I envisioned a heating system that was based on fermentation rather than combustion, with a profitable alcoholic byproduct that would maintain a constant temperature, comfortably radiated into a space through the subfloor. And when I did the rendering, it was beautiful. And I knew it was right. And I presented it. And I will never forget the way that my teacher smiled at me. He closed his eyes, shook his head, and said, "I had a feeling that you were going to be the one I would read about in the paper someday." I don't have words to describe how much that fucked me up. Not being able to go on to build a prototype, to test it, all the things that went wrong with it and my career, broke me. I felt like I had let him down. And now we don't even have physical papers, so when that phrase rings in my head. I feel very much like it's too late. Maybe we'll see this. Anyway, the actual marquee I would like to talk about is Bill Gates. I know. He was really at the forefront of warning about carbon emissions before it was cool, and has consistently stood up through his foundation for the environment, has been extremely generous for what that's worth. I hadn't actually listened to his talk, so I went back and watched it, and I found his points about nuclear energy in particular really resonated with me. My allegorical understanding about Scorpio is that the discovery of nuclear tech is somehow latent to them prior to its weaponization. There is something primordial about splitting the atom that has to do with them, and I don't fully understand it myself. But you might think of it just as decay, right? So his point was that the ideological bias has prohibited the advancement of nuclear research. And that was taught to me when I took a class called Engineering the Environment as well, where we studied all sorts of things, life cycle analysis, cradle to cradle. It was a really good class as well. I don't know that nuclear is the ultimate solution to our energy woes, of course, but the fact does stand that we have massive amounts of waste, which is probably not good to have sitting around. And that depleted uranium, if we could utilize it in the meantime rather than burning coal, would be a really good thing. And he made the point that new discoveries are still happening in this field, and putting up a barrier to the technology might cost us a very valuable secondary discovery. And he has pointed out that we can test these systems with much greater precision today with the use of algorithmic iterations. Toxic waste management, contaminant remediation, and chemical or biochemical engineering would be the three really wordy headers for the Scorpio mission. This is a very tech-heavy section compared to some of the others which were more socially oriented, which might come as a bit of a shock, being that Scorpio's primary motivation is love. I might just be seeing it wrong, I don't know. The project that was originally suggested to me to feature by a Scorpio was a company that is using vermiculture, or worms, in regions which don't have plumbing, to create composting toilets to prevent the spread of disease and parasites. So, decay, decomposition. Paul Stamets is the one that originally sprang to mind on the topic, but he is not a Scorpio. Terence McKenna is, though. We're coming to understand so much more about mushrooms as a topic that fascinates me in particular, with their resemblance to our own neural networks, the way they connect everything out of sight, mycelium in the soil, or the bacteria that make up our gut flora. I really like the notion that we should think of ourselves more as ecosystems rather than individual entities. Maybe we wouldn't feel so separate from the environment if we could see how alike we are to it. Fungus, joinery, pop-up books, nuclear physics. I think this one is easier to look at as a network of small projects and parts working together. Trying to come up with a unifying title is somewhat difficult, which might attest to why it's currently being handled so badly and how desperately we need to get a move on into these emerging technologies. So, full disclosure, I have not finished reading the Gulag Archipelago. It's on my pile, but when I started thinking about Sagittarius mission, oddly enough, that was the first thing that sprang to mind. There is a very strange paradox that occurs during imprisonment. Maybe that will be relatable to some of you at home right now. But when you truly are removed from the bustle of your regular life and forced to spend some time alone with nothing else to do, sometimes profound discoveries are made. That is not the condition being created by our present industrial prison system, So that is the primary directive of Sagittarius to be addressed. But there is something therapeutic about the process of sitting to reflect on the value of your own life and freedom. Neuroticism cannot take hold where gratitude is present, and certain types of deprivation can force you to never take certain things for granted again. It is possible, instead of turning resentment upon your captor, to utilize the time to look inward and find the freedom which was there all along. And that is exactly what Solzhenitsyn did. And his courage and ability to speak that truth into being through his book freed not only himself, but an entire nation from its knees under the yoke of communism. So don't ever think that what you're doing doesn't matter, even if it doesn't seem worthwhile to journal about your personal experience. That's simply not true, because journals have changed the entire course of history. It's already very much in flux where I am, having recently legalized marijuana here. The whole of our narrative on the misguided, racist drug war is coming crashing down. People are calling for justice for the people whose lives have been destroyed by minor drug charges, but it seems that reparations may be slow in coming, if at all. While Aries manages the front end, Sagittarius must handle the ethical containment of people who have committed crimes, and the direct correlation that that has with mental health. We are currently experiencing a complete and utter breakdown of the boundaries between those two issues. Instead of providing support for mental health, the people who are actually suffering are thrown in with all the others, and the crafty are able to appropriate that in defense of their willful wrongdoings, with no distinction being made on either treatment, depending on the color of their skin, anyway, right? Prison is a catch-all for the unwanted, and our system is deeply broken. It would take really so very little for even marginal improvement, but in speculation about a truly optimal solution, I think it would be something where the sentence left the person in better shape than when they started it. I've always associated Sagittarius with the concept of walkabout, both because of the resonance with Australia and also because of the inherent healing qualities of prolonged solitary wandering. Many philosophers and psychologists have utilized such hikes to sort out their thoughts and speak on the value of them for mental wellness. Extensive studies have been done on the relationship between time spent in nature and improved mental health, and even just visual contact with nature in reducing hospital stays and aiding recovery. So we might task Sagittarius, although Libra is looking after urban planning, and Taurus with restorative land use, with the development of parks and recreation. This priority has been largely neglected in recent years in defiance of the data. Budget cuts to preserving national parks and damage done to monuments by overuse are really encroaching on our right to free open spaces. It's important to have access to the ability to feel small, to have areas without light pollution so that you can look up at the stars and be overwhelmed by the infinite. It's a big part of what shaped our ancestors, and we are so out of touch with it. It's no wonder we're so sick. I really don't know too much about being a ranger or park management, so I can't exactly speculate about what the optimal version of that is. There is always the issue of actually getting lost or into a dangerous situation, but with drones and GPS innovation, it might allow us to enjoy more safety in uncharted, uncurated land experiences. And having people designated as guides more readily in demand as a full-time job can have great consequences in the grand scheme of conservation, especially taking into consideration biomes which we, in the not-so-far future, may be living much closer to, such as the ocean. having experienced wayfinders to take people into the wilds and come back with a better understanding of themselves and their place in the world is very important. The actual current nominee for Champion of Sagittarius is Alex Gray, artist and visionary. He spent very much time in reflection and underwent many dark nights of the soul to bring us breathtaking visuals depicting our interconnectedness. And his Chapel of the Sacred Mirrors is a temple dedicated to bringing together artists to shine a light on our mutual condition. Artist therapy is something that I've given a lot of thought to, as well as the way experiencing wonder changes our brain and opens up our receptivity to new ideas. While Virgo is dedicated to physical healing, Sagittarius is right there, addressing the psychosomatic impact of mental strife on the body and creating a space for healing. I really loved the talk by Josie Lewis about using flow state to temporarily suspend the overcritical part of our brain to relieve its overbearing pressure for long enough to allow for healing trauma. So the mission headers would be as follows: promoting recreation, rehabilitation in incarceration, and mental health cultivation. I sincerely, from the bottom of my heart, wish you all mental clarity and hope during these chaotic, uncertain times. The dragon of the unknown is staring us down, and I think that somewhere down its gullet is the key to freeing ourselves from the prisons that we are now seeing the extent to which we have been kept in. For the time being, we rest, reflect, and chart a course. And once this all blows over, I hope to see you all on the other side, with hope in your eyes, eager to pledge your steel to mine. My whole life, I've fallen into the trap of taking this one at face value, at the very literal level of physical structure and support. Capricorn lays a foundation, the underpinnings, the infrastructure that makes up the scaffolding from which all other ideas are hung. But in actuality, our lives today are relying more and more on platforms which are not physical. In my own domain of e-commerce, I've thought long and hard about how to bridge the gap between the purely digital experience into something more tactile through rendered architectural simulation spaces, but so far that line of thought hasn't led to anything particularly actionable. I just have a strong feeling that the answer is in there somewhere, and I've always kind of hoped that somewhere along the line of one of my obsession projects, some other sublime truth about it might reveal itself to me, but it hasn't happened yet. I'll keep you posted in future videos. When a sufficient amount of shared Conflux content has been created, I'm very much looking forward to being able to address my Capricorn faction directly with my own ideas. But for now, I will do what I can to introduce this faction in general. The destroyer that I found myself wanting to introduce, Alan Watts, is no longer with us, but I wanted to at least touch on his concepts again, because I feel like he effectively conveys the abstract, non-physical structure that is so crucial for the work we need to do. His recordings are a treasure. It really is wondrous that so much of his work was able to endure and retain the fullness of his character and manner of delivery. The way he talks about patterns is mesmerizing. If you listen to him long enough, it's as though they start to be a touchable, pliable thing. It's a little counterintuitive to the usual Capricorn drive to plan, produce, manifest, build it and they will come, yet quantum physics shows us that there's an infinite plane of potential already here vibrating before our eyes. The need to impose order on the environment falls away when you can resonate with the beauty that's already here. And that's something that I have really had to work on. And it's hard when your insides are screaming that if you would just work harder, things would improve. There's a time and a place to really grind. And it's not just aimlessly all the time, which was certainly how I was conditioned, and that's taken a lot of effort to reprogram. But now, facing the downfall of these traditional Saturnian structures that we were allowed to just keep churning out without a real goal, it really begs the question, what kind of an armature would uphold the most sustainable ideas? On a meta level, we should start talking about the scaffolding for scaffolding, a platform which supports other platforms, which brings us to the unconfirmed nominee, Naval Ravikant. He's probably best known for his talks on how to be wealthy, which of course fuels my Capricorn suspicions pretty heavily, but really it's from listening to him and his thought process. His work in supporting startups brought many new forms of commerce into being, which didn't exist previously, including Uber and Bitcoin. And through AngelList, new and innovative platforms are being born all the time. So the big revelation for me recently is that you can't necessarily design the optimal structure. The conditions are right, and it comes into being. The forms in nature, which are self-assembling, including our own DNA and cells, don't need guidance or organization. And in the same way, there is a deeper energetic rhythm and programming than we are able to perceive. The phrase, luck is when opportunity meets preparation, is really apt, and he talks about that specifically as a good start, but that we create this other next tier of meta opportunity for ourselves by developing our character and brand. And that's exactly right. You knowingly or not create a program, law of attraction style, which can come into alignment with the timing and current environmental conditions if you are able to recognize the pattern being presented. It's a little confusing given the incredible stagnation that we have seen in recent years in a number of creative industries, but I like to think that the profit motive is the main thing that's the inhibiting factor in that, and not necessarily that we have run out of ideas. I really love the book The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield, and in it he talks about striving to make yourself a conduit for ideas and try not to take any credit for the inspirations gifted to you by the muse. Holding on too tightly to things as inherently yours forces a disconnect from the flow. But by being secure in your abundance and understanding that the more energy you allow to move through you, the more force that you are giving to the current, and that it's not finite. Or as Naval would say, it's a positive sum game. So just to speculate wildly for a moment on the circumstances that brought some of these disruptive platforms and technologies into being, and see if we can tease out some answers on what platforms we most desperately need, let's look at Uber as a specific example. Right? Uber only worked because there were so many and underemployed people who had vehicle payments to make, and the interface was intuitive and easy to use. So it came about at exactly the right time for the economic conditions, and the demand for this type of work outlet it then became more trusted and reliable. The people came to regard it as a legitimate form of transit, and it came to really disrupt the existing taxi industry, for better or for worse. Etsy works now because a critical mass really built up in the beginning with the vintage sales. Don't quote me, I don't have the exact hard figures at my disposal right now. But my understanding is that after they gave up on studio with materials and handmade goods lumped in together, they outweigh the original sort of concept of vintage sales. But knowing boatloads of sellers from both camps, it's easy to see the economic opportunity that was first made by the vintage boom when thrifting was a huge deal a few years back. It was a huge improvement over eBay or having to pick by hand, and for the people who already had the skill set for knowing what to look for and how to inventory it, it wasn't necessarily a ton more work to use it. Even though, just like Uber, the lion's share of the work rests on the individual contractors. And now that things are established, the maintenance done by the platforms themselves is fairly minimal. I think for the time being, successful upcoming platforms will follow in that model, creating a space for exchange where people looking to make extra money can put in work without a centralized company needing to formally employ and bankroll them. So given that framework, we could speculate that there might be something up and coming that is more effective for selling stock resources like photography. There's lots of those out there, but none of them are particularly good in my opinion. Open source programming is growing rapidly, so any number of purely labor or service oriented sites might see a big boost as conditions fluctuate, especially now that working remotely is calling so many other things into question. It will be interesting to see how that really changes the scape of the available offerings. I think it's possible that we will see a big leap in what constitutes advertising in the near future. I've always been really fascinated with micro actions. Not like in the way of loot boxes, but in breaking down a large set of data that needs to be interpreted into tiny little tasks, like the way that reCAPTCHA does. Fun fact, those annoying little word photos that you are asked to type out to prove you are not a robot are actually fragments of books which are being digitized or translated. So the mission of Capricorn is to build the mechanisms that break down monstrous tasks into bite-sized pieces and incentivize huge numbers of people to each do a tiny part. If you task a single person with trying to move a mountain, they will laugh in your face. But if you ask millions of people to each transport just a handful of sand, one grade at a time, and in intervals so small they don't even notice, that's really what cells are doing. Tiny, tiny pieces self-assembling. The program tells them where to go. Each individual doesn't need to place the word that they are typing out into the correct order in the book, of course. The asset is tagged and it automatically goes there. So maybe it will come down to a case of carrot versus stick. If platforms are constantly pushing these subscription models that allow you to pay money to get out of watching ads, maybe the big innovator will be the one that up and allows you to interpret some scientific data in lieu of doing either of those. Sisters of Eve was one such initiative within a video game, which offered in-game currency, which ultimately also translated to real-world money value, for participating in identifying proteins and mapping out the human genome. We have no idea what the upper limits of that are. When such mini-games, as it were, are added on to existing systems in place of mind-numbing ads, can we start to undo the damage done by decades of rabid consumerism? I think that's what it means. Structure. Like we have all been living in boxes which are precariously stacked on top of one another, and at any point one could slip out and the whole thing could be sent tumbling. The mission titles are Transaction Platforms, Essential Infrastructure, and Synergistic Architecture. I could go on all day about Earthships and sustainable building technology, and when I first sat down to write this, I assumed I would. But I went for a walk today in the rain, and the smell of the earth was intoxicating. And I realized that simply being enchanted with it is not enough. Our panic has been eroded by a decade of greenwashing, and we've been placated away from taking extreme action with regard to the climate crisis. I bought in too, with the typical Capricorn hierarchical rationality, that I would work my way up the ranks, and then somehow magically at the top I would get some authority to call the shots, and then it would finally be my time to implement some sustainable practices. It was dead wrong. But the only way out is through, and maybe by now I'm a little bit closer to figuring out what we are actually supposed to be doing. Logistics is a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it's tempting to advance as rapidly as possible, to minimize the need for warehousing and having things sit around, not getting any use. But on the other hand, our ultimate goal should be to limit transportation as much as possible and localize. Our relationship with objects got a pretty decent reality check with the onset of 3D printing. But as much as costs have gone down on that, I think it's becoming obvious that it's wondrous for prototyping or one-offs, but hardly a major solution for production on a large scale. The knack that Aquarius has for innovation and imagination is best applied at the front end of design, preferably with the intent of eliminating any potential waste down the line with things like innovative, biodegradable, or otherwise useful packaging, plastic-free distribution avenues, superior reusable containers, and things like that. Product development itself very much falls under this sphere, though it isn't exclusive to any one faction by any means. I think that the major interventions into distribution will ultimately be under the same jurisdiction of the sign tasked with transporting them. If the cargo and the vessel evolve simultaneously, instead of having to try to accommodate one another later on, it opens up more potential for synergy. There is overlap here with urban planning, of course, as we transition to more rail-based, electric, and potentially hydrogen-fueled vehicles. The way they shape our cities and lives will have to be planned with great care. One very unconfirmed nominee that we might put here is Jeff Speck, but we could just as easily mention him under Libra since we don't know the birthday. His work on the impact of downtown spaces, having areas for pedestrian-only traffic, and the relationship that people walking and on bikes have with plazas and storefronts that are open and inviting to them, really inspired me a lot. I think any advances in logistics need to really focus on these being the end destination, everything kind of flowing and converging into these places the way that we would want people to do naturally. And I daydream really frequently about barrier-free public spaces. The only place that you really get to see this here is theme parks or places that are enclosed that have been specifically designed for foot traffic. There are, of course, many ancient palazzos, courtyards, markets, and, castles, because they just have those in Europe. But this type of living space is pretty much non-existent here in America. I think what we might end up saying is the hallmark of the Aquarius mission isn't big, flashy advancements in vehicular transport, but maybe a stark lack thereof. This is the part where I'm sure a lot of you are expecting to hear about Elon Musk, but not only is he not a general, though he is certainly a highly performing individual, I wouldn't say that his priorities are at all in line with those of the conflux. Any ideas of space colonization run completely counter to our goals of sustainability, and the phrase, "there is no planet B," should be at the heart of what we do. Drone technology is crucial for many things, like emergency deliveries, rescue, and scouting, but I'm not sure that we should be investing in them as a major avenue for delivering goods. I theorize that the optimal solution would be subterranean, built into the infrastructure as we move forward in building new cities, and perhaps to replace trucking on a larger scale with something unmanned and passive. I had a wild shower thought for a while there that to address both the issue of trucking and rising sea levels, we should create a giant underground lazy river flooded with seawater where floating cargo packs would float along across the country, being checked along the various waypoints and pulled off at their correlating stop. This, of course, only works for non-perishables, but in the grand scheme of things, we need to stop shipping our food entirely, and we talked about that at length during Taurus. So, if we assume food can be fully localized, and the only things that we need to ship are manufactured goods, maybe an underground channel or conveyor could take them between major hubs without creating emissions. But of course, we are very impatient these days and require instant gratification. So that is a lot of what drives the unsustainable practices in shipping. Simply being willing to wait a little bit longer could have a profound impact on pollution. One concept that I think will begin to really expand once cities become more accommodating to collaborative workspaces is the Thing Library, championed by the organization My Turn, where instead of individually owning things like power tools, musical instruments, appliances, and so forth, just like a library for books, it's a place where you can go to rent things so that you don't have to have them around and store them all the time. There are, of course, hardware stores which already have rental programs. Some of them can be fairly economical for the most part, but they really don't compete with how cheap it is most times to buy things brand new. There are so many other ramifications to doing that, though, and creating demand for more and more things to be produced. Ideally, makerspaces would be much more readily available, and not just like the ones we have around here, which have really expensive monthly fees and focus way too much on 3D printing. But what if in the future there are basically workplaces that, instead of people doing as we do now and showing up to work for someone else, there are places to voluntarily show up to work on your own stuff at, or form collaborative groups at will, sharing in the same tools and resources. Always there is this stress about accountability and what if something breaks or there is inequity in the use. But I think trust will be the currency of the future. Maybe the mission of Aquarius might have more to do with translating the leverage of clout or trust. I like to think of that faction elementally as clouds, either as we have in the sky or inside of atoms, in the electron fields of potential, a gaseous state for things to settle out of rather than being capable of some sort of rigid organization. It might be thought of something like creating space for play, finding a balance between potential output and making resources available where they can be put to use. Theoretically, not in the American school system, obviously, but ideally a school setting would make supplies available to students. A library is one component of that, but maybe the campuses of the future are just more flexible workspaces where people get together to tinker. Aquarius isn't necessarily the one supplying the space, they are moving things into the space. The pages or the stockers, delivery people, but not in that dreary warehouse hellscape type of way we are encountering more and more. The vibe is much more of like the hyped up auntie who swoops in with just the thing for that. Simply having things available, I notice this a lot with food. It's really easy to make healthy decisions and ration properly when things are just in front of you and ready to go. You know, when a snack tray gets passed around, people, for the most part, will eat a variety, and it will be distributed pretty equitably. This knee-jerk reaction that we have to the thought of having to share things with people is quickly disproven by what naturally occurs at any potluck. I don't know if you ever got to read the Stone Soup story as a kid. Maybe I'll do a reading of that one. But the gist of it is that everyone comes together with what they have and share it. And in doing so, you come up with something that is greater than the sum of its parts. Instead of each ingredient, which would be inedible on its own, being hoarded. If nothing is ever in scarcity, there is no pressure to hoard. Obviously, the focus here is on objects rather than food. That's just easier to illustrate. The basic set of stuff that any individual really needs to have is not all that broad, and people are by and large more trustworthy than we give them credit for. People are wasteful when they themselves feel disposable, and any risk of materials can be easily mitigated by genuine curiosity. As long as learning is occurring, it is well worth it to sponsor the iterations. In a way, it's much more worthwhile to do so in this type of setting, because the odds that an individual on a hobby level, the way we run things now, is going to make some sort of major stride or improvement is kind of extremely low. Individuals perform much better when there is support and momentum from being able to do activities in a group setting. Like children on a playground, the willingness to share is essential for learning. I had a hard time pinpointing the nominee for Master, but I got kind of a whisper to my ghost that it was someone who I already know of who has inspired me, and lo and behold, as per usual, the piece just fits. Dr. Michio Kaku has been a huge influence on the physics series that was supposed to come before this one. His generosity of spirit with regards to science is so desperately needed these days. Making science accessible really speaks to the mission of Aquarius. I think accessibility is exactly the right word. Dissolving these barriers to entry into science is something that he has put immense energy and enthusiasm into, and I have a lot of respect for him. And of course also of his forebears, Carl Sagan and others. But his determination to remain relevant and involved, instead of sitting back on his accomplishments and resigning to academia the way that a lot of others have done, is really admirable. And he is just so dang charming. His infectious curiosity makes it really hard not to want to throw yourself in and get involved. He has both a level of healthy criticism and also extreme open-mindedness to new possibilities and what their real-world applications will be to our lives. My favorite quote from him right now is, "The next time you are kidnapped by a flying saucer, for God's sake, steal something." There is no law against stealing from an extraterrestrial civilization. It's not wrong. That whole phrase is just golden. That level of humor is exactly the hallmark of an effective teacher, provocative without being self-righteous or condescending. So the charges of Aquarius are collaborative workspaces, efficient logistics, and resource accessibility. I was originally going to explore a lot more about vehicles, but my gut just really keeps coming back to envisioning a future largely without them. Space experiments are unjustifiably resource-intensive and environmentally damaging when it comes down to it, and Dr. Kaku has been as critical about missions NASA runs as he is spirited and vocal about the exciting possibilities of space travel. I think it comes down to, it's really fun to think about, but not a good idea to act on at this junction until we get our planet stabilized. And I personally have my own strong opinions on it because I think the arguments that we make valuable scientific discoveries up there are really easily overturned by the obvious fact that we have only explored about 5% of our own oceans. That's insanity. If we really wanted to be serious about figuring out how to colonize space, we should put all of our chips down on seeing if we can do it first in the sea. Worst case scenario, we figure out a really great backup plan for when the ocean levels rise, and best case, we save a ton of money by not crashing rocket ships. More on that point to follow. In a way, I worked on this faction more than any of the others. Upcycling and salvage are topics that I have researched extensively, And I normally associate it a lot with the plastic crisis in the ocean, and in particular the topic of seasteading. I think that's too literal. I don't remember which speaker it was who said it, but he said that when your kitchen is flooding, do you mop the floor or plunge the sink? Neither. You turn off the faucet. And it was just such an obvious slap in the face. I think my obsession with monetizing recycled plastic, although it is still probably really important and worthwhile to do so, I think I might actually be wrong about its importance. Maybe that really is the last step. I'm actually feeling a really big wave of relief. Like, I'm so happy to be wrong about this, in the hope that it makes room for something else. So let's throw out my presupposition and revisit this issue completely fresh, okay? If the last sign is also the last step, what does that look like, as it simultaneously is going on with all of the others? We can't just neglect to clean up at all, of course, but there are certainly more effective ways of doing it. I've always really loved the project Precious Plastic, which distributes free educational materials and schematics to help people turn plastic into valuable products, and also Plastic Bank, which creates an exchange system in impoverished areas where people can trade in collected plastic in exchange for life necessities like school tuition or goods. But I feel that more of the benefit of that comes from just the poverty alleviation itself and not the plastic per se. Certainly go check those projects out if you feel called to do so, because they are doing really great work. But people all around the world are doing great things, and that's not always the same as being part of the mission, necessarily. The whole grounds of this theory is that if things are done in line with these missions, that is playing the role of turning off the sink, and therefore is the top priority, from which the other solutions will be made either unnecessary or obvious. With packaging, as we discussed in Aquarius, the ultimate goal is to remove the need for it completely via the efficiency of distribution. Afroz Shah says, Mother Nature is very neutral. It's a neutral medium to connect and love each other. I love that. So it's possible that part of the Pisces mission is the management of the volunteer network in that sort of teach a man to fish type of way, rather than banking on one large company to come along with a huge ocean net to scoop up all the plastic. Plastic pollution is so insidious because the pieces are so small, they float and get everywhere, and you almost have no choice but to remove it all by hand. It's possible that it could be mechanized, that in the future we could have some sort of robots, either programmed or remotely operated, who go around and collect garbage. The logistics of that would be rather nightmarish for sure, but maybe if it was presented as a game or monetized so that maybe kids could play it in lieu of the repetitive fetch quests that they are already spending countless hours on. Pisces might have more to do with robotics than I originally thought. My instinct is to throw that in with air signs, but that might just be a bias that I have. So to bring up Horizon Zero Dawn again, one of the most spectacular concepts in it is that the machines themselves have their own ecosystem, where there are these herbivore type machines that consume organic material and convert it into biofuel, and scavenger machines which salvage parts from other damaged machines and from ruins. The current work of Boston Dynamics springs to mind, but they aren't really working toward this salvaging end so much, I don't think. Really what we want is more like WALL-E, right? Recycling is not a really great solution in the long run because, in a paradoxical way, it has become kind of a virtue signaling band-aid that only encourages overproduction while recovering very little on the far end. It's simply too difficult to separate the different materials, and some materials are hardly worth bothering with due to their weight versus their value, such as glass. Trying to reclaim and melt it back down is a huge amount of effort even when you automate it. And a large portion of it ends up going right back into the trash pile and getting thrown away anyway. So we need to address the garbage crisis itself. For the time being, during the transition, until we can get to the point where all of the other systems that we have been talking about come online to prevent things from entering the waste stream to begin with, we need to come up with really actionable solutions to landfills and clearing them out entirely and preventing new ones from being filled. One technology that's kind of old hat now, but is on the right track, is the tech of spec fuel, which is basically taking the leftovers from recycling and grinding them up for combustion instead of sending them off to landfill. It's not an ideal solution for energy production as a whole by any stretch, but it does replace coal. So it's a matter of taking incremental improvements rather than holding out for some perfect final answer. Our hesitation in taking these small improvement steps to scale because the margins aren't wide enough is really holding us back from getting to those final solid systems. We should have been beyond coal entirely a very long time ago. But instead, we are like, oh, well, until we get this Tesseract going, we are just going to keep rolling with the coal thing. There's a lot of overlap between Leo and Pisces here because these systems are both used for energy production, but the primary goal is to use them for processing waste. The number one priority that we all can do right now actually is not recycling, but composting and elimination of food waste. It's infinitely more important for carbon sequestering, and we as individuals have full control over that. We need to get all organic matter out of the waste stream, and innovative processing systems such as Michael Smith's Green Powerhouse uses organic material to create biochar and also cultivate algae to create a high-performance soil restoration substance. That process is very multifaceted, so it doesn't belong to just one faction. In fact, if there was one project out of all of these things that I've mentioned that we should really be fully throwing down on right now, that's the one. But I want to focus on the front end of it as far as just diverting organic matter and making use of its carbon. I think that's a big part of the Pisces priority. Of course, I could carry on forever about the various technologies utilizing recycled materials to create things like building products, but I really want to steer away from the individual startups and companies because an overall definition of the Pisces mode is what is really needed to complete this balanced set. It is the modes of the factions, not the specific standouts. It is the system behind them. If we were made aware of it, we would have such a better chance of being able to contribute to it. In this life, we have limited attention. That's really the currency, because we are only given so much time here on this planet, and it's very difficult to focus. Our brains are wired to respond disproportionately to things which invade our consciousness and present themselves as being a matter of survival. And ad psychology has exploited that to the point of putting us in really great danger and being unable to refocus when needed. And it's something of a cruel joke that the things that are the most important for our life can appear so serene, like the ocean itself. Looking at it, you would have no way of knowing the peril that it's in. So it's very easy for the flashing neon and the cell phone alerts to call out to us like sirens to our doom. The medicine of Pisces might have more to do with the conscious decision to stuff wax into our ears and tie ourselves to the mast to stay true to our course. So who do we look to? Who is our Odysseus at the helm? The unconfirmed Archon nominee is Morgan Vague, a scientist working on training bacteria to digest plastic. If we look at the plot of Horizon Zero Dawn, we see a blurring between fantasy and reality. Fact tends to be much stranger than fiction, And the fledgling character, Elizabeth Sobek, got her start in very much the same way that Morgan has. The gut flora that might make up the digestive system of a mobile trash-targeting robot may be growing in her lab right now. The seeds of the world that we are trying to build together have already been planted, despite it all. And that's the message of peace that Spirit has really been emphasizing to me this week through the chaos. When the conditions are right, it will happen. And making room for our future in our current lives takes a shift of consciousness more so than any one specific activity. And that shift compels us to come together and to take one another more seriously, stay in our own lanes, and stop getting overwhelmed by anxiety. We need to start putting some serious muscle behind the initiatives that are building momentum in the direction of our victory conditions. The Pisces mission can be broken down as salvaging materials, processing waste, and human resources, which might also be thought of as reclaiming attention. Here in the beginning, the organization of the volunteer network will largely be in their care, though, of course, the infrastructure and hub for that will be provided through the website. I have already put a lot of research into the structure for this volunteer system and coordinated with existing orgs and volunteers to address their user interface concerns. And at this time, the challenge is made all the more complicated by the need for expensive background checks and other ridiculous barriers to entry. So in a way, something less centralized might actually find its day in the sun with the ability to circumvent those formalities and just start connecting people to take positive local action. Obviously, we must wait out some of these growing pains before collaboration comes back to the forefront, but in the coming months, my focus will now shift away from the purely theoretical content and onto the meat and bones of the system. I have so much more that I could say, and I'm sure that I've brought on an order of magnitude more questions than I have managed to resolve. But in order to provide the best possible service, what I need to do now is create the tools that will bring value to your life. I hope that this brief introduction has at least given a glimpse into what might be possible, and I will continue making videos, but nothing quite like this. This series was a real test. I gave everything that I had of me to create something real, and I would be lying if I said I wasn't terrified. It would certainly be a lot easier to take off my clothes or scream profanities into a microphone over a video game. This philosophy is a rough way to go. But I'm down here in the arena every day, and if it's not what you want, there's plenty of other shiny screens to go get lost in. But I'd like to think that there might be some among you who will hop that rail and get down here in the sand with me. There's a line from a song by The Siege that really got me today. I've got an army full of gladiators, monsters, hairdressers got us looking like some rock stars. Honestly, there ain't enough power on your roster, and so on. And I thought, damn, if that isn't the mood. If we switch our thinking from my day job is X, and then I go home to work on whatever I'm actually interested in, but I probably won't because I hate my life and I'm dead inside, to my day job is to do something that I don't mind doing and I'm pretty good at, to benefit the faction mission. And then, because everyone else out there is doing that too, I have quality outlets to pursue my other hopes and dreams, secure in the knowledge that my basic needs will be provided for. And if you are going to argue with me that that isn't a better mode of thought and outcome, then you damn well better not be doing it because you truly believe that we are on the right course right now. I'm all ears for you to tell me that I'm wrong on specifics, and I'd love to be wrong, honestly. If I messed up the gist of one of the faction victory conditions, or have some specific facts wrong, call me out on it. It's not the place of any one general to speak for the others. That's how the balance works. It just had to start somewhere. So I threw my personal understanding out there, just in case it might do some good. Thank you so much for sticking with me through the whole of it. If you watched the entire Supercut, what a treasure you are. Thank you very much. And if you don't mind leaving some kind of comment and feedback, I would very much appreciate it. Not because of the typical YouTube fishing for likes and comments thing, but because I'm in an echo chamber otherwise, and I have no idea how this message is really being received or how to proceed. So if you'd like to have some say in the future of the content, please do interact with me. Thank you.